Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of Orthodoxy, Autocracy and Nationality, Byzantium, the Golden Age. Very lucky as always to be joined by Columba, hello.
Hello, gents.
And by Marcus, who miraculously is joining us after having a little bit of an accident. So we're very glad and lucky to have you this week, Marcus.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Yes, I'm very grateful to be here. It was a minor traffic incident, but yes, like I said to you, an airbag in the face is not pleasant. So I'm glad to be here and intact. So let's get cracking.
With this and the illness, I think there's a conspiracy set up against us. So someone wants our channel down by any means.
Yes, luckily I haven't had to pull out yet. There hasn't been
yeah, you're next.
There hasn't been some sort of act of God yet, but we'll push on regardess. We'll
praise the good Lord.
We'll get this series done, all 30-something episodes done. And we have, I guess, thinking about it, the idea of 60 to 100 hours of constant streaming about Greek to Russian history does sound exhausting looking back on it, but hopefully it'll be quite a milestone when we finally complete this series, because we're already about a quarter of the way through. But anyway, yes, obviously with
great works come great satisfaction too. I remember that.
Absolutely. So we ended our conversation last week around the reign of Michael III of the Amorian dynasty, and really we're going to pick up where we left off and elaborate more about the ascension of Basil I and the Macedonian dynasty. In terms of, again, a broad overview of this discussion, we're going to start by talking about the Macedonian dynasty. We'll discuss the Macedonian Renaissance, moving on to obviously the zenith of the Byzantine Empire with as the image shows here, Basil II, the Bulgar slayer. We'll round off talking about the decline of the Macedonians, the Battle of Manzikert, and the brief Komnenian Restoration in the 12th century. And yes, hopefully that'll lead nicely on to our discussion next week when we discuss the Fourth Crusade. So without further ado, we'll start. So really, I mean, in terms of a beginning of this conversation, I thought the Photine Schism is quite an interesting point to start off, because we ended off last time talking about the missionary activity of Cyril and Methodius, and their expansion into Bulgaria and among other places, Greater Moravia, etc. I think why obviously this schism is significant is that Photius, who is also known as Photius the Great, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, argued again definitively for the powers of the patriarchal see against the filioque. And just for a bit of context, within the Nicene Creed, from the Catholic Nicene Creed, you state, the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father and the Son, and this is the idea of the filioque, the idea that the Holy Spirit descends from the Father and the Son. In the Orthodox Creed, the Holy Spirit descends from the Father. So this is basically understood to be a later theological addition, starting around the time of Saint Augustine of Hippo. And,
I think it's based on a passage from John, I think.
Yes, and there was a lot of scripture evidence backing that up. But nevertheless, in terms of the creed, this is where we have the you could say the differentiation between the Byzantine Creed and the Latin Creed. In addition to the linguistic difference, you have this fundamental difference about the true nature of Christ, as in what is the true nature of the Holy Spirit. And this element is added in around the 6th century in the Western Creed, and becomes very popular in the 9th century. And so Photius, rails against this, believing that this is a fundamental corruption of the creed and Chalcedonian Christianity. In addition, the Byzantine Church was also not practicing clerical celibacy. In fact, it became almost expected that priests would marry before being ordained, whereas in the West, as we later see with the Reform movement, the expectation was the exact opposite, that clerical celibacy needs to be maintained. And that is a distinction that even exists to this day regarding the division between the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic churches. And I think in terms of the political overtures, a lot of the political ramifications of the schism were actually around the conversion of Bulgaria, because the Patriarchal See wanted Bulgaria to be subordinate to the church in Constantinople, whereas, of course, the Pope wanted Bulgaria to be subordinate to the church in Rome. And definitively, during the reign of Khan Boris of Bulgaria, Bulgaria decided to opt for Constantinople and to accept an autonomous archbishopric underneath the patriarchal see of Constantinople. So as a result of all this, we have the Photine Schism, which again is going to be further substantiated by the East-West Schism. In terms of the political events of the time, we have, of course, Michael, who is Michael III, who is the last of the Amorian emperors. It was more or less assumed that he would be succeeded by his uncle and Caesar Bardas, because Michael was in a very sharp decline, brought about by his alcoholism at this point. And I think it's just interesting to talk about the early life of Basil, because unless I'm mistaken, Marcus, you could probably correct me here. He's called Basil the Macedonian, but that's only because he was born in the province of Macedonia. Well, his family originally came from Thracia, and he ethnically was actually Armenian.
Yeah, that's so far as I and a lot of other people can surmise it is true. And the interesting thing to keep in mind here is that, and this is an issue quite quintessential to the Balkans. I mean, we can all chuckle at the joke. And Bismarck's, for instance, his particular slight towards the Balkans. But even at this point in time, like even before you've had even more dramatic ethno-demographic changes in the Balkans, a name, for example, such as Thrake or Thrace or Macedon or Macedon, as we'd say in English, these names are sometimes used for different geographical regions that might be adjacent to one another. For instance, in this period between like this sort of the end of the Amorian dynasty and into the Macedonian dynasty, Macedon as a province or a theme is in fact more or less correlated with modern day southern Bulgaria. That sort of runs along the Evros or the Maritsa River in the present day, which is not in either the Greek Macedon of today or in the nation of North Macedonia, which is sort of on this map actually just now being flicked across, proximal to where Thessalonica is and above it.
We also talked about. Sorry, I just wanted to say.
No. By all means, go.
There are these rumors that swirl around that Basil was also descended from the Arsacid dynasty, the sort of Persian dynasty. So we should keep in mind, and we talked about this last time, that what with the Muslim conquests and what have you, many people from the Sasanian Empire, the Persian Empire in the east, had fled into the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I think the idea that he was descended from the Arsacid dynasty was perhaps a later invention by Photios to try and give the dynasty, more gravitas and more of a royal pedigree.
Sure, I could agree. I'm just speaking in terms of like the overall
the mythos
situation or demographic situation. Yeah, I think it's reflective of something.
And certainly the mythos is interesting. To sort of, I suppose, get to the point of what AM's asking, though, essentially, my understanding is that a family of Armenian extraction relocating to the Balkans, because we have to consider also that the Balkans have, as a result of the Slavic incursions, as a result of the establishment of the First Bulgarian Empire and the influx of Volga Bulgars and their kin across the Danube, the Byzantines were quite preoccupied with stabilizing this frontier, considering the vulnerability of its capital, Constantinople, to this frontier. And so it would seem logical that this Armenian Orthodox family, certainly a Grecophile Armenian family, and we see this a lot in certainly this middle period of Byzantine history. There's actually a great deal of Armenian influence in many of the high ranks of the empire, right up to the emperorship. And it's quite an interesting, a symbiotic relationship, because sort of Armenians and Greeks, I suppose, have this kind of religious kinship, firstly, and secondly, they both sort of sit at the periphery of this Christian world in the face of Islam. So they're kind of pressed into this kind of brotherhood in this sense. So definitely I buy into the consideration or the assumption that, yes, Basil, though called the Macedonian, I think is more a case of him being named after the place he was born or grew up in, as opposed to his ethnicity, but he's indeed of Armenian background.
There's one question I wanted to ask you, Marcus, which is, of course, during this time we have the ascension of the the Policians, which were a Gnostic, basically Christian heresy movement that was emanating again from Armenia. And it didn't just originate in the territory of Armenia, it has spread, throughout most of Europe. Where did this group come from exactly?
I was under the impression they're because a number of rebellions occur in this period, and we touched at the end of the last stream. I sort of spoke about the formation of the things and how they're sort of a reconsolidation from the Diocletianic sort of sub-provincial system and sort of a compromise between the two. It definitely was a reconstitution of that, and because you're talking about the Policians, right?
Yeah.
Yes. That they found a lot of support, ironically, in a lot of the frontier provinces, because the Policians themselves were quite populous in what once we flick over to the next screen, I can talk later. But in the themes, for example, of Karzianon, of Lykandos, the eastern portion of the Armeniaic theme, these quite critical parts of the empire that border the caliphate. And quite often they either are in league with rebel generals, in the case of, say, the Bardas Skaleros and Bardas Phocas, whom we'll talk about later, and with incursions. For instance, just prior to the Macedonian period, you have two important events. You have the sack of Amorion, which is the downfall of the Phrygian dynasty, which we did mention last stream, and the conquest of Melitene. And this sets the border at its present locality. Melitene becomes a fundamentally Greek city, becomes a part of the empire, becomes a frontier city. And interestingly enough, the Policians assist the Arabs in resisting the Byzantine reconquest of Melitene. So there's a nice little insight for you.
Yes,
and they were in fact treated more harshly than the Arabs were by the Byzantine army after the battle.
Yes, I think again this comes into the fact of religious unity and heretics being treated perhaps worse than heathens in this case, as was the case with Muslims.
Quite, yes.
But going back to Basil.
Just for the chat's sake, that battle is called you can either call it Siege of Melitene or the Battle of Lalakalon. That's what that's called. Sorry, go on, Ayam.
Going back to Basil, begins his career as, essentially a glorified peasant. I mean, from what we understand, he was a very, very strong, very physically well-built man who was operating in the stables of Michael and was really his friend, if nothing else. And yet he's able to, in a very short amount of time, about 5 years, rise from the rank of, basically a stable hand to the co-emperor of Michael III. And he does this by being able to successfully isolate the would-be heir, Caesar Bardas. In fact, as far as I'm aware, during an attempt to reconquer Crete, Basil was able to successfully convince the emperor that Bardas was actually trying to lure the emperor away from the capital in order to kill him. And right in front of him during this a premature campaign towards Crete, Basil personally murders Caesar Bardas right in front of the emperor, and then it's basically justified
with the emperor's consent, mind you.
Yes,
from what the sources tell us.
Well, I think the emperor sort of agreed with the it was basically a fait accompli that Basil presented him, and then the emperor came to believe later, yes, this was in fact justified. Yes, Basil is my friend, and this is where we have the marriage of Basil with Eudokia in Gerina. Just to put this in context, we mentioned last time that Michael married his mistress off to Basil. The reason for doing this was it was basically considered, beyond the pale for Michael to divorce his wife and marry his mistress. So this was a convenient way of allowing his mistress into the royal household, now that Basil had been promoted to royal chamberlain, and basically continuing his affair whilst, ostensibly, Basil was just... he wasn't actually going to sleep with Eudokia. And this is where we get the dubious parentage of Leo, who would later become Leo VI the Wise, regarding whether he was actually the bastard son of Michael III or the legitimate son of Basil I. And ironically, if that was the case, then the Macedonian dynasty is a misnomer, and it was actually a illegitimate continuation of the Amorian dynasty. But so this is the, weird circumstance which creates the dynasty. Even though he had a previous marriage, he was married to Maria, and producing a son, Constantine, who was his preferred son and his intended heir. But
what's even oh, may I just interject briefly?
Sure.
What's even more remarkable actually is that Basil himself isn't necessarily initially a friend of Michael III. He in fact befriends a friend of the Caesar Bardas, and it's actually through a number of wrestling competitions and Basil's propensity, due to his immense size, to pummel his opponents, that actually impresses the emperor. And so the emperor, as a result, this associate I think is called Theoktitsos. He's a friend of Bardas, and so within a short space of time, actually appoints Basil as his essentially as a member of his bodyguard, and considers him a companion. So he invites him right into the inner sanctum, and like you say, he masterminds the death of Bardas, and then he's right in the inner sanctum of imperial power. And then, like you had said, he marries Eudokia, and he's right on the cusp in a very short space of time.
And of course, he's not content there, and the emperor is further descending into delinquency, and so he takes this opportunity to kill the emperor as well in a very bloody murder, and this establishes the Macedonian dynasty.
So before he murders the emperor, had he what sort of duties had he taken on? Because you said he was the royal chamberlain.
And he was also the co-emperor at this point. He'd been made co-emperor a year
before.
I see. After he kills Bardas, he was made the co-emperor, because prior to him killing Bardas, he was the emperor's
grand chamberlain.
As I say in Greek, he was the parakomomenos. He was the right hand man of the emperor even before becoming co-emperor.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yes, and this is obviously Basil, despite the fact he's illiterate, and despite the fact he's this uncouth Armenian brute essentially, and wrestler, he becomes one of the most successful of the Byzantine emperors. First of all, he tries to resolve this the Photine Schism, and does so by basically capitulating to the Pope in the Fourth Council of Constantinople, where Photius is anathematized. Basically, the emperor concedes to the position of the Pope, and therefore prevents a longer lasting schism like we'll see with the Great Schism. In terms of but again, this is quite interesting, because he then reverses his position, and Photius has this remarkable return to power after again finally defeating his longtime rival, the Patriarch Ignatius. And as we'll discuss later when we talk about the Macedonian Renaissance, he is a great compiler of information. He's responsible for the Nomocanon, the compilation of synodial canons of the Greek Church, and he later becomes the tutor to Basil's children as well. And as we said, Columba, I think he's also responsible for this potentially invented heritage for the emperor, that he actually descends from the Arsacid dynasty as well. So he, from originally having been thrown under the proverbial bus by the emperor, he later becomes instrumental in the myth making and the propaganda making of the new dynasty, which also includes denigrating the image of Michael. Because again, one of the paradoxical things, it's called the Macedonian Renaissance, but many of the thinkers and events which create that Renaissance actually happen during the regency and the reign of Michael. So, and this of course ends with the original sort of period of the end of the Second Iconoclasm, and that sort of ushers in the great sort of cultural renewal that we see throughout the 9th century. But just in terms of his military success, before we get into talking about that proper, he was successful in, as we mentioned, defeating the Policians. I think that this was the Battle of Tifriki, and therefore consolidates the eastern frontier. He also expands and consolidates the frontier in southern Italy, in Crete and Cyprus, although Crete and Cyprus would invariably switch hands quite a lot of the time between the 9th and the 10th centuries. Although Syracuse was definitively lost in 878, as we discussed on our Guelphs and Ghibelline stream, Marcus. So also, what's also important to note is that he was also a great builder. Perhaps he was the greatest builder since Justinian himself, because he's responsible for not only the renovation of many of the churches in Constantinople, including the Hagia Sophia, building the Treasury House, restoring the various royal residences and palaces. But he's also responsible for completing the Nea, or the Nea Ecclesia, the new church, which is basically the first grand church in Constantinople after the Hagia Sophia, overlooking the Golden Horn. And you can say this is really the culmination of the period of architecture after the second iconoclasm, and the symbol of this Byzantine rebirth after this the Dark Ages of the 8th and the early 9th centuries.
It's also indicative too, because we spoke about this to some degree in the when I was talking about the re-establishment of trade routes in the Mycenaean stream, about sort of when sort of classical Greece kind of hit a critical mass where it sort of flourished again because of its wealth and because of its economic activity. You kind of see, it's not similar because obviously we're talking about very different times and different circumstances, but Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, is hemmed into this Anatolian heartland with a smattering of holdings in southern Italy and in the Balkans. But by this point, and the themes are a part of it, they're not all of it, because some people do overblow the effect of the themes to a point, both militarily and economically. But the empire is adapted to this Anatolian heartland, and it's actually the Anatolian heartland has developed militarily, has developed economically. And as a result of factors both internal and external, more wealth has been pouring into the empire. The trade coming through Constantinople has been lucrative in a monumental sense. And with this wealth and with this stability, even though we've seen the rather frequent usurpations and dynasties falling away and others taking their place, but this sort of period of stability and prosperity in a macro sense has allowed for these circumstances to happen in which Basil can be a builder, in which he can be a rejuvenator. That kind of period's come into play again.
I think. I mean, I'm not an expert on this period, which is why I'm just sitting and listening. But it does make sense to me because I mean, I imagine that when the Eastern Roman Empire was larger and when they still controlled the Levant and Egypt, much of the administrative sort of bureaucratic structure of the empire would have been centered around these big cities, like Alexandria and Antioch that we see on the map, and this Anatolian sort of hinterland wasn't of the same kind of key importance, and it's only after you have the anarchy and what have you, and this pressure that we see the infrastructure necessary built up in Anatolia, I suppose.
Absolutely, and I think I mean, in the end, this is a history stream, obviously, and not an economic one. But one thing I will say, and I do want to touch on the economy perhaps a bit later if we get the chance to, because there's an important thing to talk about just before the Komnenoi come into play. But what can be said is that stability and prosperity are completely indispensable for the welfare and for the ability of a nation and a culture to maintain itself. And the other thing is that there's a qualitative and a quantitative component to these things. And what you sort of see is, and you sort of just touched on it, with this contraction of the empire to sort of Anatolia and this sort of Balkan Italian periphery, is almost they've had to increase the efficiency of their existing provinces. They can't just rely on the cash cow of Egypt. They don't have this vast taxation of these Syrian estates, and all these cities dotted along the trade routes, which Antioch was, which Kallinikos was, which Jerusalem was, Alexandria, etc. But that Anatolia itself has become this sort of vibrant economic hub that is being able to sustain the empire, is being able to sustain the themata and and is being able to sustain the targuma, and is actually allowing the emperors to expand the commands, to expand the themes themselves, to be able to produce more of this sort of military power, which then can exert out of the power. Because what we really see from the Mauryan dynasty onwards is almost 200 years of unhalting re-expansion. There is this sort of this counterattack that Constantinople unleashes both east and west, and it's quite remarkable considering the state that this empire was 100 years before this time.
Yes, before we sorry, Columba.
I was just going to ask another question about because you mentioned the reconquest of Crete and Cyprus around this time, and I'm wondering was this accomplished with the Byzantines' own naval forces? What's the situation with Venice at the time, or are they're later around 11th century?
By this point, it's a domestic navy. It's a domestic naval force that works in conjunction with the army without much in the way of external influences.
Okay, no bother.
Like, for instance, we'll touch on obviously Nicephorus' focus later, but like his army set sail from Constantinople at the head of a Greek fleet when they reconquered Crete.
I think there's one thing to consider, which is until Nicephorus' focus, the empire actually doesn't expand that rapidly to begin with. So, for example, we have the death of Constantine, who is the intended heir of Basil, and this causes, his own decline and depression. You can even say domination by Photios, and he succumbs as a result of a supposed hunting accident, which is very probable that it could have been an assassination attempt by Stylianos Zoates, who was the father of Leo's mistress, and he would eventually marry her and become a second wife after Theophano. But Leo is really interesting in the cultural and legal sphere, because in terms of his actual military career, I'll just quickly give an overview. This is coinciding with the height of the Bulgarian Empire under Simeon the Great. Most of Sicily falls to the Arabs. Thessalonica is sacked. The Arabs defeat the Byzantine navy again. Simeon actually marches on Constantinople and forces the emperor to recognize his title as Basileus and the first Slavic Tsar, which is where we get the utilization of this term, which will later become used by the Russians, comes from the Bulgarian Emperor Simeon, appropriating this basically concession from the Byzantines, from the original title of
what does the word mean?
Tsar is Caesar.
Oh, of course. Sorry, it's been a long day. It's been a long day.
It's a Slavonic translation of,
Yeah.
Yes. So, but yes, of originally the Bulgar Khan, which evolves into the Slavic Bulgarian Knyaz, which means prince, and then we have the brief and uneventful reign of Leo's brother Alexander, and eventually the succession of Constantine the Seventh and his 4 regions. But this gets on to the administrative and cultural changes, which the Macedonian Renaissance, which, as you mentioned, happens before the reign. It happens, you can really say, during the regency of Michael III, the Amorian, and this is officiated over by, as we said, the Empress Theodora, and another Theokistos, not the Theokistos which Marcus was referring to, a eunuch courtier who basically oversaw again ending the period of iconoclasm in the 1840s. And this is again when we get back to Patriarch Photius again, who, in addition to being a great compiler of ecclesiastical texts, he's responsible for the Bibliotheca, which is a great ecclesiastical history, and he creates also a reference book for reading old classical authors. And we were asked a question last time, to what extent were the Byzantines responsible for the Renaissance? And this is really what we have at this period, the great compilation of all of these beautiful works of the Western canon. We have the lexicon of Photius, which is basically used as an aid in reading these sources. We have also the expansion of the legal system. You can say the creation of a distinctly Greek and Eastern legal system, as opposed to the Western adoption of the original Byzantine law of the Corpus Juris Civilis. This is the Epanagogi, or the Byzantine law book, which originally had been commissioned under Basil, but forms the basilica during the reign of Leo the Wise. In fact, in Greek, he's actually known as Leo the Most Wise, and this replaces Leo III the Isaurian's Ecologa, which basically had become redundant at this point, and translates and compiles all of the evolving nature of Roman law into Greek for the first time, as opposed to Latin, which up until then had been the you can almost say the exclusive language of the law. So in terms of, again, the orientalizing of the empire, and again the Greek dominance and hegemony in culture, you can really say that this is continuing throughout this period. But it doesn't just extend to history and law and compilation. We also have Caesar Bardus establishing the Palace School, or the Ekpaiditerion, or at the Managra building, which was headed by Leo the mathematician. There had already been, an older University of Constantinople, the Pandidikateron, which had been, established in 425. And these institutions were, interestingly enough, responsible for providing, a secular education, rhetoric, philosophy, and law, for, providing education for the statesmen of the empire, as opposed to the, the more ecclesiastical education. And these are the institutions that kept the, philosophical traditions of Platonism and Aristotelianism alive. For example, the Organon, or the 6 works of logic by Aristotle, was, a key source of reading during this period. And in terms of like other sort of great organizer of these, classical works of scholarship, Arthaeus of Caesarea is responsible for creating the canonical work of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, etc. I mean, Leo the mathematician, I kind of see him as a Leonardo da Vinci of this period, because in addition to being, responsible for the creation, he was basically a compiler of medical works and creating a great medical encyclopedia during this period. Of course, as the name suggests, he was a mathematician. He was a great philosopher and logician. He was also responsible for creating automata. So when we get to the account of Liutprand of Cremona, we have these amazing accounts of these artificial animals and the hydronically raised throne. All of these were sort of designed during the reign, during the time of Leo the mathematician in the early 9th century. All of these wonderful contraptions that made the empire look, almost, in a different world in terms of its technological capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, the West at this time, I mean, any sort of learning was restricted to what? I mean, you had the some stuff going on in the Carolingian court, I suppose, but yeah, nothing on this scale.
Nothing
nothing. No.
There's actually a really good anecdote, if I may. I will be very, very brief. I just cannot. I can look at it while we're on the chat and confirm it. I can't remember exactly which emperor, Holy Roman Emperor it is, but a Byzantine princess marries one of the princes. I might be one of the sons of Otto II. I can't remember.
Oh yeah, Otto III. It's Theophanu. Yeah, she's married off to him, no?
I can't remember if it. I think it's someone else. I think she's Anna Ducana. I think she's or anyway, I'll find out. But the wedding, essentially the wedding reception's in Venice, right? Because obviously Venice is a halfway point between the HRE and the East Roman Empire.
In a lot of ways, yeah.
And the Empress arrives at the banquet and she unfurls like this sort of. If you ever seen like a chef, they got like their knives and stuff and their cutlery like rolled up in like a cloth sheet. They obviously would have an imperial version, but much more ornate and decorative. And she rolls out this cutlery set and she has a fork. And all these Germans and Northern Italians have no idea what a fork is, because in the West they had forgotten the function of a fork at dining. But it's maintained in the East. Yes. Yeah, I'll see if I could find it.
And Columba, the empress you're referring to is it's the wife of Otto II, and it's Theophano, the daughter of John Sysimachus.
I see. Okay, so I get confused because there's
there's many Theophanos, yes,
and then there's a Theophano as well. Yeah, so it gets quite confusing.
I think another point I'd like to comment on is I'm amazed by the skill and the art, especially the mosaic on the right hand side of this slide. As far as I'm concerned, really the beginning of naturalistic image making, trying to get the likeness of people, which you could say has a later effect on Italian art in the 13th century in the work of Giotto. I really think the tradition of Western art as we know it, which will reach its zenith during the 16th century with the work of Caravaggio, etc. I think it really begins here, which is this revival of classical art in many senses sort of begins here. In addition to, again, this being a period for the sciences, this is also a renewal for the arts. I mean, it's not just that. I mean, you mentioned the economy, Marcus. I mean, Leo the Wise, in addition to compiling the Basilica on law, he was responsible for the Book of the Prefect, or the Book of the Eparch, which was basically a compilation of a list of regulations concerning collegia. And of course, collegial groups were basically the equivalent of medieval trade unions. The conduction of trade and customs, what sort of crafts were going on in the empire, the import and sale and moving around of silk. And basically it was intended as an effective manual for the governor of Constantinople, but really it serves as a major economic record of the early 10th century. So yes, I mean, in addition to that, we have the Geoponica, which it was attributed, I think, to Constantine the Seventh, Porphyrogenitos, which is basically a compilation of all the knowledge then known about agriculture. We have the De Ministrando Imperio, which again is basically intended as a manual for the later Emperor Romanos, basically advice on foreign policy, and it gives a remarkable insight into the geopolitics of the period. Basically an instruction book for ruling.
Exactly. And what's remarkable about that is it being, I mean, whether the emperor did it all himself or partially himself, we will never know the answer to that truly. But the fact that it is a work which was cognizantly thought of by an emperor, or at least he had the idea to compile this work as a result of this. And a lot of people don't sort of realize that Byzantium at this point in time was probably one of the first nations to have an extensive sort of a coherent understanding of espionage, of spies, of actually acquiring knowledge of foreign enemies beyond its borders, and their activities domestically. And that is a compilation of that knowledge in a book.
Yes,
it's quite intriguing.
Yes, and I'll get onto that quickly. But just before we discuss that, he also is responsible for the De Ceremonies, which is the Book of Ceremonies, and so an incredibly extensive. I think the first book, for example, contains 37 chapters, and it describes all the ornate processions and ceremonies which one encounters for religious festivals. The elevation of the cross, Christmas, the Epiphany, Palm Sunday, Good Friday, Easter, and Ascension Day, etc., and all the various saints' days. Whilst we have chapters for secular ceremonies, rites of passage, coronations, weddings, births, funerals, celebrations of triumphs, feast days at the hippodrome, etc. And this again is to give an idea of certainty within the empire, but also exhibit grandeur and a sense of permanence within these imperial administrations. That there is a way of doing things, there is an order in everything, and there is a protocol associated. And again, you can say that in many senses, this is the creation of a modern sort of court system, or a modern sort of you could almost say again the idea of an enduring sort of heavenly order where everything is orchestrated and organized according to a grand plan orchestrated by the emperor, because we have all of these specific stations and ritual actions and acclamations for ministers, senate members, and this even extends to the members of the Blues and the Greens, which beyond just being charioteer factions, they were also political factions in their own right. They too had roles in the court ceremonies. And this, in terms of a precedent for this, a lot of this work had already been compiled by Peter the Patrician, who had been the one of the great ministers of the Emperor Justinian. So again, there is this, you can say, revival of this attempt, because again, Justinian is associated with grandeur after the, you could say, the austere rule of Anastasius. That after the austerity of iconoclasm, there is an attempt to again empower the empire culturally through these displays of grandeur and these administrative ceremonies for all these functions, and this again conveyance of a palace order. In terms of again the implications of this, you mentioned the intelligence service, but there was an actual a specific bureau which was set up for dealing with this, which was the Bureau of Barbarians, which was an intelligence service. I mean, the Book of the Ceremonies, it wasn't just for the sake of the empire and the grandeur of the emperor. It was.
You might say it wasn't just a vanity. You know what I mean?
No, it served an important diplomatic function. I mean, basically, as the Byzantine Empire lost out militarily, during the reign of Heraclius, and undergoes the anarchy and iconoclasm, it emerges from this and adopts, diplomacy as a means of basically survival. Centering around diplomatic marriage, the process of assimilation. We've already seen this through the assimilation of the Bulgarian court, and we'll see this later with the assimilation of the Rus court as well. Many of the princes on the periphery of Constantinople were expected to keep an embassy in Constantinople, which would last years. Many of the members of the royal houses around the periphery were also expected to send sons to be educated in Constantinople, and they would then come back and continue this assimilation effect. I mean, this is, you could say, the masterful use of soft power as opposed to hard power. And again, this is
doubtlessly,
brilliantly demonstrated by the accounts we have of the Bishop of Cremona, Liutprand of Cremona, who also gives the explanation of all these wonderful automated machines to elevate the throne, for example. I mean, and you can say Vladimir the Great's conversion to orthodoxy is you can say the summit of this in terms of being able to win over an ally of such a huge ally in the sense of converting the Rus. through prestige. I mean, there is this idea that he sent ambassadors, intending to convert to Christianity. He sent ambassadors to all of the various Christian sects, and converted based on the city of Constantinople and the fact that if there were a god, it dwelt in Constantinople. I mean, Constantinople was a city of treasures. It was basically a marvel of the world, and it was intended to showcase this the supremacy of soft power. And I mean, in terms of the effect of the marriage as well, is that a Byzantine marriage could legitimate a new dynasty in a foreign kingdom very quickly, and this is what happened with Vladimir. Vladimir
Absolutely.
was married to Anna Porphyrogenitos to substantiate this Byzantification of the Rus. And you can say that if there were a rebellion on the periphery, the Byzantines could easily create a new legitimate dynasty out of nothing that would support the Byzantines based on this application of the diplomatic marriage. So really, in terms
they truly married out into a lot of different places as well. Exactly. I was looking over this. It's quite a list,
And that could also be and also that was demonstrated time and time again. Often, two things I just want to quickly cover. One, there are so many sources from so many different foreigners that went to the city, who would walk through the gate of St. Romanus, or would walk through the gate of the Blashane, or would land by ship in one of its ports and just be almost indescribably awed by the sight of the city. Between the Hippodrome, the Great Palace, the Hagia Sophia, all these landmarks, which would have been, you think if you even came from 8th century Kiev, or you came from the north of the Crimea or from the Danubian basin, you have seen nothing remotely close to what Constantinople is. And the sheer impression this would have made on these, I don't say this to be derogatory, but these more simple people would have been, I actually don't have the vocabulary to describe it myself.
Yeah, I mean,
it would have been massive, right?
It would have been even more impressive than today. I mean, especially no doubt. When you think of the Crusade, which we'll cover, and the sack, which we'll cover in the next episode. I mean, God,
right, yeah.
I mean, the stuff that was lost there and the stuff that was there before. Like, I mean, the most famous one is the the horses of Saint Mark.
Venice,
I think Dandolo just took those, and so much was lost. So the whole place was just brimming with antique statuary, because Constantine had taken pretty much all of the finest art in the Roman East, and
exactly, and also Theodosius a little bit as well to an extent. And the second point I just wanted to make briefly about this sort of use of soft power is, if you look at once we get into the thick of, say, Basil and Constantine or what have you, one of the ways in which Basil II prevails in the rebellion of the two Bartuses, because towards the end of their rebellion they actually unite, strangely enough, and it's his marriage, it's him wedding his sister off, Anna, their younger sister, to the Kievan Rus, to the prince, that we see the establishment of the Varangian Guard. And it's these, I think it's 8,000 or 6,000 warriors he gets,
6,000,
are indispensable in actually defeating the Bartus rebellion.
Exactly. So, I mean, just because I want to get on to more of that later, but just a quick sort of conclusion for this.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. In addition to all of this, in terms of, again, the encyclopaedism of this period, we of course have the 10th century Suda, which is the comprehensive Byzantine Encyclopedia of the Mediterranean, which had something like 30,000 entries, something completely remarkable. And then,
as a historical source, it is incredibly useful, because it's full of fragments of all sorts of ancient works that have no other attestation whatsoever, really.
Absolutely. And in terms of, again, just probably finishing this off, we have the Chronographia by Michael Sellos, who was one of the great intellectuals of the 11th century, and this chronicles the reign of Basil II onwards. And again, I think in terms of assessing this period, either we can see it as a rebirth, or we can see it as a great area of amassing information or compilation, as opposed to perhaps maybe in art. I think there is definitely a sense of innovation, but in terms of and in diplomacy and politics, there is certainly innovation. But a lot of this is compiling and standardizing what you consider to be the Western classical canon, rather than inventing new work, so to speak. So there wasn't this massive original outpouring of poetry and literature at this time. Nevertheless, there was this major consolidation of all the information that was available at that period.
I would say the art kind of reflects this as well. I mean, if you look at the mosaics that are being done, at this time, sort of 9th century, they are very impressive. But I mean, This just seems to have been a recovery of the kind of, I mean, because if you look at I can't remember the name of the palace, but it was the one that Justinian built, and it's full of it gets called the Great Palace Mosaic, and this is what, 6th century, before all of the chaos and the shrinking of the empire, and they're highly advanced, as advanced as anything from even the 2nd century when the Roman Empire proper was at its peak, and so yeah, it's in many ways. It's a return to form, and it's a return to the specifically Byzantine idea of grandeur, I suppose. I don't see them pushing forward in a way, if you understand my meaning.
Yes, and I think this is why sort of when we see the Renaissance, it is really going to be in the sort of 14th century and the 15th century Italy, where this civilization is continued. And of course, Italy has that stability and that prosperity in that time where, Byzantium is in its death throes. So sadly, the whatever could have been if the civilization had continued is lost forever. But I think just in terms of like a final point before we get back onto the chronology and talk about the military side of this history, is what's remarkable is that we have this legal consolidation of the empire under Leo the Wise, and we have this Byzantium is the master of diplomacy. I mean, it is able to outlast its militarily superior rivals throughout all of this. I mean, we mentioned the Arabs, we mentioned the Rashidun Caliphate, we mentioned the Umayyad Caliphate, now the Abbasid Caliphate. Throughout this same period, so we're talking the late 9th century, early 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate was collapsing. It was fragmenting into all of these different principalities who only owed some sort of nominal authority to the Caliph who was in Baghdad at this point. The Abbasids themselves would be controlled by the Buyids, and eventually towards the end of this time frame we're discussing, the Seljuk Turks, but even they would collapse. I mean, in many cases, Turks were brought in as the slave soldiers of these Arab empires towards the 9th century onwards, and these Turks would basically create Turkic principalities, and so the actual political and legal collapse of the Muslim world was incredibly swift. Even though you had the Golden Age in art in the Islamic world, politically it was collapsing, but Byzantium was able to politically and culturally cement its existence and outlast those powers which could have almost very nearly destroyed it during the crisis at the end of the 7th century and the beginning of the 8th century. So I find this remarkable that the empire is able to undergo such a transformation. I mean, even the Abbasids, they were basically being pushed out of Egypt at this time. Cairo was now part of the Fatimid dynasty. So yes, in terms of the Arab world, by comparison, it was collapsing. I mean, the only sort of exception to this in terms of political power around them collapsing is that the Holy Roman Empire will slowly begin to reconsolidate when Otto becomes Holy Roman Emperor in 962. But even before then, had it not been for Otto, it's very likely that the Frankish Empire and their legacy would have just collapsed, and it would have just dissolved into tiny kingdoms much faster than actually happened, in our own history. So again, just emphasize how remarkable it is that the Byzantines were able to recover.
Just one quick point on that. Actually, what's interesting too is you think that with in what we touched in the latter part of the stream with the Arab invasions into what was a much larger East Roman Empire, one which was the Empire of Justinian, of Heraclius, etc. It was a sustained, it was a direct, it was a unified, coherent attack from the Rashidun and later the Umayyad, and to some degree the Alghabid, if you're talking about North Africa, Caliphate. Attacking the empire in its various frontier provinces, and these frontiers collapse in you're talking a rapidly short space of time. In 100 years, in the case of a 2 millennia empire, is a very short space of time. But what's interesting here is when the Byzantines start counterattacking eastwards, with the recapture of Melitene, with the eastern campaigns that are prosecuted by the generals such as John Corcuus and by Bardas Phocas the Elder and by Nicephorus Phocas, they're picking off essentially small independent territories. Like Melitene at this stage is an independent emirate. When Byzantium subjects the emirate of Aleppo, it's an independent entity. I mean, they're not attacking this great Arab Caliphate, great Arab empire at risk of being attacked in force by a larger empire. They're picking off these little independent states that are fractured in the midst of the Abbasids essentially disintegrating, which makes those campaigns easier.
Yes, I think one thing I've got up a little map here, and you before coming on, we wanted to discuss the themes. Obviously, you've alluded to the campaigns of Nicephorus, but just before we get to, you can say the real expansion proper under Nicephorus II and under John Sysimachus, and then under, of course, Basil. Would you like to discuss, the administration of the empire? Because of course the tagma from 950 onwards really begins to decline, and we have the growth of mercenary armies during the reign of Basil. So would you like to explain the system of administration more?
Yeah, so you very kindly put up these two maps. They're easy to see, but sadly they use the Latin terminologies, which slightly upsets my Hellenic sensibilities. But nonetheless, very, very, very good maps. And you can see here, they very much took to heart that notion of consolidating these provinces. So these small, tiny, fragmented Diocletianic provinces are gone. And pardon me, this 750 map actually isn't exactly representative of the, let's say, the origin point of the themes, because in the south here you have this almost unpronounceable theme of Kypriaioton, as they say in Greek. But before that, it was the theme of the Katabassianoi, and that was the naval theme. That was the theme which was responsible for the construction of ships, for the training of crews for the Imperial Navy, and then they would be primarily sent to the capital, to Constantinople, where the sort of imperial dockyards, to use inverted commas, resided. But in the case of Arab incursions into the Aegean, it would actually be that theme, the theme of the Kypriaioton, would be the first responders essentially to any hostile Arab incursion into the Byzantine sphere. So you look at this first map, that consolidation has taken a very serious thing. And for those of you who don't know, some of these provinces are actually named after elements of the tagma who were deployed at the time and were simply named after the tagma that were deployed there. For instance, the Optimatoi or the Optimaton were a tagma, and they were located in Nicomedia. So that province was just called that. The same with the Bucalarians, or the theme of Bucalarion. I think the same is true of Opsikion as well. They are named after imperial units deployed there. In the case of the Anatolic and the Armeniaic theme, they're simply geographical references to the localities of those themes, and they're a consolidation of a number of provinces. They're, in the case of the Armeniacs, that's Chaldea, it's Pontus, it's parts of Cappadocia, and it's integrated into one theme. And because it's a frontier theme, it's made particularly powerful. The same is true of the Anatolic theme.
How would you guys, because I'm not an expert on this area, but recently I've been reading Hilaire Belloc's works on what he calls the great heresies, and talking about the schism and what have you, and also Islam. And he says that one of the main weaknesses of the Byzantine Empire is that it's always too Byzantine, using the sense of it as being sort of too complex, and there's too much bureaucratic build up. And he argues that in many ways this was one of the reasons for the great success of the Arab invasions and the Muslim invasions, is because they replaced this interminably complex system with very simple laws that everyone can understand. Things like the jizya, just the tax, things like this. And so when we see this sort of increasing consolidation and the increasing addition of themes, do you give any credence to the idea that this is a sort of, it increases inefficiency and instability in the long run, because we have this sort of useless buildup that complicates things, makes things more inefficient? What do you think
about the theme system directly, or Byzantine governance generally?
Byzantine governance generally. I guess what I'm trying to say is, do you think that the themes were a remedy to this problem? Because I mean the system, we seem to see still see failures later on, obviously. So I'm just trying to gauge where you would relate the theme system to those comments, I suppose.
AM, do you want to go first, since Columba kind of asked you, and I'll follow up?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think that's borne out. I mean, one of the remarkable effects of the Byzantine Empire is it's able to constantly reform and reconsolidate and update its legal systems, as we see with the Basilicon during this period. I think, the themata and, obviously replace the provincial system, and the system is able to, adapt continuously towards, the various threats of the empire, adopting towards, more localized, more defensive structures. And I think in terms of like complicated, defeating political structures, you can say feudalism in the West is much more self-defeating than the centralized administration of Byzantium in the East. None of which sort of dissolves into this patchwork sort of feudalistic nation states and city states like in the West. And with the East, central authority completely dissipates. I mean, the rulers of the Abbasid Caliphate basically rule for the last 200 years of their existence just from the city of Baghdad, and then they rule essentially as prisoners of the Mamluk Sultanate in Cairo after the sack by the Mongols in circa 1250. So I think the Byzantines actually for this period, we're talking the early medieval period, actually show a remarkable resilience and ability to adapt to the changing circumstances. So much so that they have survived for hundreds of years of continuous attack.
I suppose I just wanted to throw it out there because it's a common point thrown at the Byzantine Empire as one of the main reasons for its collapse, that it was just this stultifying
well, I think ironically this is actually attributed to the Book of Ceremonies. The fact that there is a ritual for every procedure, there is a ritual for every appointment, there was a ritual for every feast day. But like I said, this to me isn't a demonstration of the uber complexity of the empire, but rather in many ways its endurance and its simplicity, the fact it does have these functions and procedures for everything. As we mentioned, it is as much a demonstration of soft power rather than a true demonstration of the nature of power within the Byzantine Empire. I mean, as we see, the Byzantine Empire is never basically able to establish a successful monarchical regime. Ultimately, if you have military power, you are able to exercise autocratic control using the administration, using the patriarchal seat, etc., to extend your rule. I mean, one thing I didn't mention about Photius is that Photius was a radical in the sense that he wanted to raise the patriarchal see to being basically the ally of the emperor, the colleague of the emperor, rather than the subordinate of the emperor. You can say he's the Eastern Orthodox equivalent of a Gregory the Seventh, the Gregory the Great, because he was an advocate for patriarchal autonomy, and because of Basil's decline after the death of the son, his depression and his very weird behavior towards Leo. You can say he was afforded all these opportunities, Photius. One of the reasons why Leo wanted to get rid of him, in fact, Leo replaced him with Stephen, his brother, who was only 16 years old at the time, was to try and wrestle control of this administration and to establish true autocracy. I mean, autocracy in the Byzantine sense, again, is anathema to the Muslims of the same period. And in the West, where we have the incredibly complex system of administration, the Holy Roman Empire, and then of course the terminal feud between the popes and the emperors at the same time, this issue arises in the Byzantine Empire during the patriarchacy of Photius, but is actually resolved very quickly and without having to result in these constant civil wars. So again, just in terms of the administration, I think the Byzantine Empire is able to survive, and really, its defeat is as a result of betrayal and constant military defeats. But I think there is one failing with the Byzantine Empire is that civil war, because of the desire to become emperor, because the emperor's position was always tenuous, and because the emperors were being murdered so often, there was a natural inbuilt instability brought about by that. Had there been, for example, a sacred dynasty like the the Julian Claudian dynasty, or the Romanov dynasty in Russia, or the let's say the Safavid dynasty later in Iran, then perhaps all of these things could have been resolved. But still, even then, I think it's unlikely. I think one of the most remarkable things about this period as well is that from 862 until until 1056, we have 867 until 1056, we have a continuous dynasty, despite the fact that such things as we take for granted in monarchical systems, like primogeniture, didn't exist. I mean, when you look at Constantine the Seventh, for example, he was the second son, but the reason he was elevated to the position of emperor is because he was porphyriogenitos. He was born to the purple, and therefore he had a precedence. So yes, there were elements of that which seem self-defeating, and you can look at the imperial system of administration and say, yes, maybe it was overly complex, and the court rituals and the scheming, and the fact that the empire was more than willing to rely on soft power, could have acted to its detriment. You can say, I don't want to be cruel, but a more simplistic people who think in terms of military action, the fact that the empire was creating this incredibly ornate and sophisticated structure of diplomacy, obviously that's where we get the origin of the pejorative of Byzantine. And this idea, goes back even further in the Western mindset to Greeks being, duplicitous and overly willing to backstab each other and betray each other. I think this is just a continuation, you can say, of that phobia of the
East.
I
mean, it's an old stereotype. I mean, you can read Roman poems complaining about the mendacity of the Greeks and the loquaciousness. Yes.
Beware of Greeks bearing gifts,
Well, I mean, that depends on if you believe Virgil, I suppose.
Quite. But if I may buttress what Apostolic is saying here just now, there's a couple of elements I want to quickly just touch on Columbus to sort of half answer your question. One, and I don't know if Apostolic's able to put video on these streams or whatnot, or whether it gets struck down or whatever, but there is a conversation. I have mentioned this gentleman in his book a few times, and he's Edward Lutwork, and his works, the Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire and the Grand Strategy of the Byzantine Empire. And in his interview that he gives to one of these California colleges regarding his book release is that the Byzantine Empire has been essentially smothered by Western intelligentsia since the Age of Enlightenment, since the French Revolution, and they have deeply reviled and they've resented the religiosity of the medieval Greeks.
Yes, they call them superstitious and
superstitious Hellenes, right? And we have to consider that Byzantology has been essentially in a perpetual dark age from it's almost like the French Revolutionary period up until sometime between now and the end of World War II. Like this efflorescence of Byzantology has been a relatively recent thing, with the exception of maybe a few scholars who have been dedicated to this in the last 100 years.
Yes, I think the exception is probably in Russia, where Byzantology, especially during the 19th century, you can probably say it begins in Russia. But it's especially in the West. It's only really after World War II that we begin to have a more balanced perspective, which doesn't have this pejorative association with medievalism.
Correct. And to some degree also in southern Italy, because you have that sort of ethnogenetic connection with
Magna Graecia
and southern Italians, right? Because there's been festivals. We mentioned, for instance, Apostolic, the stream that we did on the Ghibellines and Italy. In Gaeta, the city that's just north of Naples, they've had a Byzantine festival there for over 100 years. That extends into fascist times and even before fascist times into the era of the kingdom. That's people who have some degree of recognition of their heritage, right? That is still in defiance of that overarching Enlightenment mindset, this deep-seated prejudice that exists for all things but Byzantine. So I think that Columba, I think to some degree that answers the question about this somewhat unfair pejorative that's used of the Byzantines. What I will say is that Romanesque systems, and by that I mean everything post-Republic, I mean everything from the Principate onwards, right, has profound positives and profound negatives. One of them is the propensity for powerful people within the empire to use political, financial, and military power to become either emperors or kingmakers, right? But it's that ability to generate that power in the first place, and this ability for bureaucratic organization, for institutional and continuity, which, like I say, I've read from my essay a couple of times on these streams. Frankly, no other empire could have, in my mind, resisted the Arab invasions when you consider the circumstances in which Byzantium found itself in the 630s and 640s. I mean, the Sassanid Persia was no weak weaker an empire, pound for pound more or less than Rome. Yet the Sassanids fall, and not without valor. I mean, you look at some of those battles that they fought against the Arabs. I mean, the Persians showed their valor and their courage time and again in the face of the Arabs, but eventually the Arabs broke through the Tigris Euphrates. They broke through the Zagros. They captured Susa and Ctesiphon and Persepolis and Pasargadae and what have you, and Merv, and the nation of the Zoroastrian and Persians fell. Yet Rome survives.
Well, it's not just the Sasanian Empire. I mean, you could say this is a continuous theme. I mean, we have the Achaemenid Empire, which collapses. We have the Seleucid Empire, which collapses. We have the Parthian Empire, which collapses. And we have the Sasanian Empire that collapses. And of course, the caliphates, collapse in turn. But this Roman legal system, I mean, you mentioned it begins with the Principate, but I think it actually begins with the Marian reforms even early on, where you have this, again, the fundamental weakness in the idea that once you have these mass armies who are loyal to a particular commander, you have, invariably you have various coups, beginning with Marius and then beginning with Sulla, etc., etc., etc. That is the fundamental weakness in the system, and as a weakness that continues, all the way up for the remainder of the empire. Nevertheless, this legal continuity, this continuity of administration, is able to succeed, even though the older system of administration and the preeminence of the Republican institutions and the Senate, obviously declined during this period. It is able, to create a system of administration which lasts, for over 1,000 years, which is, incredible, given how volatile this period is.
Exactly. And despite the reversals that have been suffered by the East Empire from, I mean, we could say 636 if we're just counting the Arabs, but if we sort of count the Sassanid-Persian War prior to that, the sort of 20-year conflict before that, if you take into account the events of the end of the 500s and into the 600s, with the Arab invasions, with the loss of all this territory, with Syria, with Egypt, North Africa, Carthage, Sicily, so on, the fact that the East Romans can reorganize themselves, and you got to think, we've talked about how many times we've talked about the Polybian Legion, the Camillian Legion, the late Republican Legion, the Imperial Legion, the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine. This is an army and a society that whatever threats it comes across, whatever dire setbacks it suffers, whether it's Cannae, whether it's Abritus, whether it's Adrianople, whether it's Manzikert, even whether it's Yarmouk, this is a society and a people who have absolutely no qualm, who have this sort of deep-seated steel within them to reform and rebuild and readjust, and in the face of quite dire circumstances. I mean, you think, for instance,
I understand what you're saying.
200 years, and it still managed to, not
I understand, but there is
change in the face of it.
But there's a difference, surely, right, between the survival of the administrative structure and the success of the society as a whole, right? Because I mean, yes, you're right. The militarization of the Roman Republic that began with Marius did lead to this situation, and this is sort of the extreme tail end of that, if you will. But I mean, also look at the changes in leadership that are happening, the constant betrayals and assassinations and what have you. But also look at the tone of the society and as a whole, the kind of things that are acceptable and are common. And again, I mean, when you read accounts later when the crusade happens and when the Latins come in, many of the Byzantine people don't care. They're happy. They celebrate getting rid of this aristocracy because they don't care about it. And I just this is not the virtue of the Romans that I think people are familiar with, at least in my mind. I mean, I agree with you that there's a remarkable endurance there, but it just seems like a very cruel society, and not one I'd like to live in. Not something that seems noble or successful in that sense.
What do you mean by that exactly? I mean, in terms of a society that I'd like to live in, I mean, just putting this in context within all the other societies that existed at this time period, I would say Byzantium is the most sophisticated, the most prosperous, and the most stable of perhaps all of these societies, put together. Probably the only civilized, I mean, even China during this period, which is again the only sort of power really comparable now that the Abbasid dynasty has collapsed. China is declining. China during this period, which we've talked about in the last two streams, it has had the Sui dynasty, it's collapsed. It has had the Tang dynasty, it's collapsed. It's now on the Song dynasty, and the Song dynasty will soon lose the north of China and acquire Jin China at the same time. So whilst in the West we have constant wars, we have constant civil strife, we have conflicts between all the various claimants, which would later consolidate into the Holy Roman Empire and then sort of move into the religious wars. In Spain we have the Reconquista. In Russia we have the constant wars between the Pechenegs and the Khazars versus the Rus principalities. We have the Viking invasions in the north. I think again you have to look at this within the context of the time. You have to look at this comparatively.
And Italy was practically destroyed essentially.
Yes,
before.
Exactly.
I suppose it's just frustrating. It's just frustrating to see. I know it's just frustrating to see these destructive, at least to my mind, destructive strains in the culture, because with what they have and with this enduring administrative structure and the good grasp on technology that they have.
Enduring administration. I mean, it's a whole system of life. It's a whole system of administration. I mean, this system. Why is the Ottoman Empire
It's a capacity of civilization born and expressed by a people. In this case, the Eastern Greeks.
And it's constantly able to renew itself. So here we're going through a different period of renewal. We're seeing, the beginning of what will later become the Renaissance. It's happening here. It's starting in the 9th century Byzantium, and it's going to be carried into the West from the 11th century onwards. So really, I look at this period and I actually have again, this is an exciting period as far as I'm concerned. I mean, in terms of the aristocracy, this ambivalence towards, I mean, I don't want to go all sort of Marxist analysis, but it's a common theme that, this antipathy and this hatred towards the aristocracy is a common theme, and this existed right back in when we had the Popularis and we had the Optimatus factions, in the Roman Republic. It's a constant theme, and within the Eastern Roman Empire, I think what differentiates it, you say it's cruel, is there is actually a thoroughly religious, devout population, which have been effectively Christianized, and they are so, again, inspirational to people looking, at the empire from without. That the Byzantine Empire, rather than being reviled, apart from by various Western commentators, they're being emulated. I mean, the court of Charlemagne is. Again, emulating this. The architecture of the Aachen Cathedral is emulating this empire. The Russians are emulating Byzantium. The Bulgarians are emulating Byzantium. I mean, as we can see in terms of the successful imitations, they don't last. So getting on back to the chronology, so we don't spend an hour talking on this
yes, we could. I feel like we could.
We have the military success, of course, of the empire isn't borne out towards the end of the 10th century, and we have the ascendancy of Simeon the Great, Tsar Simeon the Great, and this is where we get the term of the Tsar, of course, from. Adrianople, one of the main cities, which is the modern city of Edirne, is sacked. Constantinople is laid siege to in 924. I mean, Simeon the Great wanted to usurp the empire. He wanted to be a successor anyway, and he wanted the Slavic Empire. Simeon the Great is incredibly influential in terms of the continuity of Slavic history, because not only did he create his own imperial court at Preslav, but he's responsible for the Preslav and Ohrid schools, which create the Cyrillic alphabet, and this becomes the basis of Slavic literature, moving on. And it's Byzantine influence through Cyril and Methodius and Photius, which enables this acculturation. And he's creating an empire, which is based on this imperial dignity, and he has imperial ambitions of, you can say, taking over the mantle of the Eastern Roman Empire. So far from, again, reviling the empire, he's trying to assume the mantle as the Ottomans later would, but he fails. His empire doesn't have the legal continuity. It doesn't have the system of administration. It's imitating the religion. It's imitating the churches. It's imitating the architecture. But it's really the product of one man. So when Simeon the Great dies, Bulgaria begins to decline with him, and we have as we have so often, we have another Renaissance, a military Renaissance. So as you mentioned, Marcus, we have the reign of Nicephorus II. The Byzantines are able to march into Syria, retake Antioch, definitively
the
take over
pale
Cyprus.
death of the Saracens.
Yes, attack Lebanon. Attack and seize the great Arab city of Aleppo, etc. I mean, in terms of like the Bulgarians, and how quickly their fire extinguished, Svatoslav of Kiev, basically overruns Bulgaria in 967. And during the reign of John, who had murdered Nicephorus II, John Sisimachus, the empire, extends into Bulgaria as a result of the decline of, the former Bulgarian Empire, and also at the expense of the Rus, goes further into Syria, taking Damascus, Beirut, Accra, Sidon, Caesarea, expanding even further.
And when you're talking that far, you're talking about this empire, these people who have not ventured into that territory for nearly 300 years.
Yes, precisely. So
that's a measure of the success of this system and this turnaround.
Yeah. So, and again, just I can't help but, and again, this is only the beginning. It's going to get we're reaching the zenith now because we get to Basil. I mean, you mentioned probably one interesting figure, which is Theophanu Columba in our last stream, and Theophanu is interesting because she's known as one of the most beautiful and intelligent women of Byzantine history, and she has the remarkable distinction of basically producing the last two male emperors of the Macedonian dynasty, being Constantine the Seventh and Basil II. Originally, she's married to Romanus II, and then he dies very shortly. I mean, she's married off very early. She's only 15.
And is Romanus, is he the son of Basil I, or what's
no, Romanus is the son of Constantine the Seventh.
So grandson then?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, great-grandson through Leo. So Basil, Leo the Wise, Constantine Porphyrogenitos, and then Romanus. And then we have Basil after that. But no, his brother Nicephorus takes over, and as we mentioned, but and then marries him. And then we have the murder of Nicephorus. And it's more or less assumed that Theophanu was basically in league with John in terms of enabling his assassination, because she was curiously absent when Nicephorus was meant to be assassinated. But basically John realizes that it would actually be politically inexpedient of him for her to marry a third emperor after this quick succession. So Theophanu is quickly pensioned off and only briefly becomes the regent when Basil becomes emperor in 976.
Apparently she's taken away screaming, bitter with John. It's quite an image. But, I mean, I think that's where Gibbon tells that story that I was talking about, where Theophanu had her handmaidens let John and his men in to do the deed.
Should we? I know you got the map here of the Bulgarian War, but do we want to touch on briefly, because I think it's almost a little unfair to. There's someone called the Pale Death of the Saracens. We haven't mentioned any of his campaigns. Should we touch a little bit briefly on Nicephorus and Zimisces?
Yes, the reason I cover them so briefly is just we have so much to get through.
But they are famed for their generalship, right?
Yes. So yes, Marcus, if you want to quickly go over them, and then I'll briefly talk about Vladimir the Great again, and then we'll talk to the talk about the Bulgarian War. So yes, if you want to briefly summarize, and I'll go back.
I have my stopwatch here, Marcus.
Go.
Oh God. So what I wanted to say is that the Crete had, and the islands of the Crete of the islands of Crete and Cyprus had there'd been several attempted reconquests of them, and none of them really came to any result. And in one instance, for instance, Constantine the Seventh, which is the father of Basil I, if I'm not mistaken, sent
Romanus is the father of
Sorry, he is. Sorry, Constantine the Seventh is the father of Romanus. Correct. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Dispatched a force to invade Crete, which had cost the empire 120,000 numismata, which is goodness knows what that figure is today, but I'd imagine
it's a lot of money.
Small fortune. But they had dispatched 29,000 soldiers to reconquer the island in 949 and failed with 29,000 men, and it came to nothing. So when Nicephorus was then dispatched a couple decades later, his campaigns in Crete were rather more successful. And what you see is with the rise of Nicephorus, is you see the rise of a dynasty, and it's one of the reasons why I actually want to talk about this map briefly. is Nicephorus is nicknamed the Pale Death of the Saracens. He reconquers Crete. I can't remember if he actually reconquers Cyprus himself or it happens under his emperorship. But he campaigns into Syria, and because his brother is Domesticos of the East at this point. Because there's a Bardas the Elder and Bardas the Younger. I'm pretty sure this one's Bardas the Younger. And between the two of them, they recapture the province of Cilicia, which, if you look on that right-hand map, is Tarsus, Adana, that southern coast just north of Antioch. They reconquered the better part of 100 large and small cities in that region. They start this push into Edessa, which Apostolic was just talking about. And Nicephorus, although a very successful general, is rather unpopular at home. He's not a very good politician and earns the resentment of John Zimisces is actually his cousin, because they're both the Phokoi, the Phocus family are sort of a Greco-Armenian family, and John Zimisces is they believe that the surname Zimisces is a translation from the Armenian word for red boots, so it's a reference towards their own ethnic genesis as a family. But sorry, I know you do want to press on, Ames. I won't delay with specifics, regrettably. But with the growth of the province system here, the Themata, you see here that there's almost a slight reversal of the consolidation. You have Paphlagonia, which is cut out of Bucalarion. You see Calvi and Colonnea cut out of the Armenia Contheme. And with the reconquest of some of these eastern cities, for instance, I mentioned the siege of Melitene. Along here, they capture sort of other cities in the vicinity, which is sort of correlates with eastern Turkey today. They recapture modern day Erzurum, which is Theodosiopolis. That's in the province of Mesopotamia here on the right. They have to set up new administrations to govern these territories. So as a result, there's almost like a slight winding back of that consolidation phase. And another reason for this too is because we did touch on when Basil II reaches maturity, which is just as we move on to the next slide, a very powerful magnate in the name of Bardas rebels against the empire because he's removed as Domesticos of the East. So Basil II's sorry, I just got my notes here. Basil II's advisor, who essentially was a part of his regency council, I believe was Basil Lecapenus, sends Bardas Phocus, who's a relative of Nicephorus, a descendant or maybe a nephew, I think, of Nicephorus Phocus, to combat him. And eventually, after two losses, he's defeated at the Battle of Pankaleia in 979. But then, and after the latter, Skleros, flees to Baghdad, he actually comes back from the Abbasid Caliphate. And the two Bardases, Bardas Phocus and Bardas Skleros, conspire to dethrone Basil II. And this is where Basil II does his deal with the Varangians to establish the Varangian Guard and marry his sister off to the Kievan Rus, and defeats both of these rebels. And then Basil himself, becoming confident in his early adulthood, is one of the first emperors to successfully attack both East and West. And this is where we find ourselves.
Yes, and I think you brought up one point which I really want to talk about is the constitution of the Varangian Guard, this is the year 988. It's also the year that Vladimir converts to Christianity, and also the Byzantine Rite. It's the year that Anna Porphyrogenitor, who is Basil's sister, is also married to Vladimir, cementing the alliance. And as you said, he supplies the new guard of 6,000 men. I mean, the Varangian Guard, starts off as an elite guard, basically mercenaries, which are famously and inexplicably during this period known for their unwavering loyalty. Once they're paid, they're basically loyal to the emperor.
I think Varangian actually comes from a word meaning pledge or oath. There's this idea of the sort of Germanic loyalty which motivated the early emperors.
Yes, and these weren't just Rus peoples; these were also Norse peoples as well. Even though this group would later be expanded after 1066 to include a lot of disaffected Anglo-Saxons who had fled the Norman conquest, and so we have this
after which had been known as the Anglo-Varangoi.
Yes, and we have this you can say this latent revenge being played out when the Normans in Sicily versus the Anglo-Varangians in Italy at the same time, although that's slightly later on. But yes, moving on from the revolt of Bardas Skleros and Bardas Phokas, Basil II is quickly able to consolidate his gains in Syria by defeating the Fatimids. And in terms of his campaign, his perennial enemy in the Bulgar Empire, the Bulgarian Empire, had briefly consolidated to the Komopuli dynasty under Tsar Samuel, and Samuel had been able to defeat Constantine at the Battle of Trajan's Gate. But nevertheless, 10 years later, Basil was able to defeat Samuel in Greece at the battles of Spercheios and Skopje. And from this, we have as you can see on this map on the left, the 20-year consolidated campaign of subjugating all of the Bulgarian cities, one by one, periodically and methodically reconsolidating the entire Danubian region, which culminates in the Battle of Kleidion against Samuel. And the Bulgarians were annihilated, and this is where we get to the brutality, as you mentioned, Columba.
So are they trying to? Was the plan to sort of push up and get the Danube as a frontier?
Yes,
sort
again,
of like the Rhine.
So it's restoring the pre-Heraclean frontier, and establishing the traditional boundaries of the empire. So this is a monumental overtaking. I mean, the only thing I can really think of as an equivalent in terms of taking a group which had settled this region and basically trying to undo the last 300 to 400 years of history is possibly Edward Longshank's conquest of Wales during the period, which had constantly been a thorn in the side of the Crown of England. This is a methodical reconquest of the region, establishing all of these fortresses, which culminate in the Battle of Kleidion.
What the interesting thing is here, if I may say, is you look at a map like this of Basil's really intentful, methodical, in some ways rapid, because he was actually renowned for his what, if I may use the word, maneuver warfare. And even though at some point in this war, the Bulgarians actually attempt to invade, they attacked by Plovdiv, which was old Philippopolis, and actually get as far as Edirne, which is old Adrianople. He basically splits the kingdom in two. And with all this marching to and fro, and this sort of this attacking and seizing of strong points, there's almost a Caesarian kind of notion to this, because Basil was known to have been a really great student of Roman warfare. And I look at this map, and it's reminiscent of Caesar and his subordinates crisscrossing Gaul. He leaves. He goes after the absolute power structure of the Bulgarian Empire, and that is these larger cities in northern Greece, in what is sort of modern day Greek Macedonia and Macedonia, which is one hub of their realm. And then in the other part, the old sort of capital up near Preslav, along the sort of the Black Sea coast there, leading up to the Danube. He attacks both of them, and he sort of is relentless in assaulting both power centers of the Bulgarians, and basically wears them out in this massive campaign, and is just relentless in engaging with it. There's something really reminiscent of Julius Caesar in my mind about this.
Well, I would ask, because obviously Julius Caesar, he spent 10 years in Gaul, but Caesar also had to constantly go back to Rome for political purposes. Did Basil have to return? Because you say he was undertaking this war for a long time. Surely he would have been concerned about his power base back home.
Well, the luxury he had is that him and his brother, this is Constantine VIII Porphyrogenitos, was they were co-emperors and brothers, and so whilst he was campaigning, he was sort of considered the soldierly, manly brother, and Constantine was sort of the more studious type, and he stayed in the capital, and the two co-emperors ruled in unison with each other.
Yes, Basil was known as a particularly gruff military man, very, very little in terms of any scholarly instinct. But I think you're probably giving Constantine too much credit in terms of him being the more scholarly one. Definitely the more sedate of the two, I think is fair to say. But as you can see by the reign days, this period of consolidation happens 20 years after Basil had originally risen to the purple. So he'd already consolidated his reign, and so after this period of consolidation, after his alliance with Vladimir the Great, then we begin to see the period of expansion. As the system of administration is secured, and like with Julius Caesar, this basically coincides with like a genocide against the Bulgarians, because at the Battle of Kleidion, it is said that 99% of all the soldiers in the Bulgarian army, when they were defeated, were blinded, and every 100 man was left with an eye so he could leave his compatriots home. And the lore is that apparently when Tsar Samuel saw this, saw his army, he died of shock. And this is, 4 years later, we have the last of the Bulgarian strongholds, which surrenders, and we have the complete reconquest. In terms of a military victory, no other emperor had even rivaled this accomplishment in terms of reconsolidating this empire. And this wasn't a temporary victory. The Byzantine Empire was able to hold on to this region right up until the end of the Komnenian dynasty. So for the next 200 years or so, this region had been, thoroughly conquered and pacified before we see the emergence of the Second Bulgarian Empire.
Apart from the military massacres that you mentioned, did they try and, in some sense, undo some of the Bulgarian settlement? Did they try and move people around? I assume not.
No, and this is why the victory was eventually undone, because when we have the weakening of the empire during the Angoloi, we have the creation of the Second Bulgarian Empire. And so in terms of the actual ethnic composition of these regions, whilst there were various military towns, etc., and military fortifications, the Serb populations, the Albanian populations, the Bulgarian populations, now Slavicized, no longer from their Turkic origins, basically continue, albeit under Byzantine subjugation. The irony being that Simeon and all of his attempts to create an imitation of Constantinople had actually done a lot of the work in terms of Byzantifying his own population and Christianizing them at the same time. So this made transition towards Byzantine imperial rule easier, and this is the population were already somewhat assimilated.
And coinciding with that too, at the end of the last stream, I spoke about how with the campaigns of Krum and his attack into what you might call Hamimontos, but that coastal Black Sea region, sort of where Mesembria, Sozopolis, Archelaus is, those bunch of sort of cities, sort of what you would call sort of between the Danube and the Bosphorus. That sort of would be today's east coast of Bulgaria, as in the modern nation of Bulgaria. The vast majority of those populations were actually taken by Krum and were used to populate the cities he was founding, both sides of the Danube, and these were mostly Hellenized, certainly Romanized populations. So some of that process of Romanization happened well before this time, and like Apostolic's just been saying, this sort of imitation angle that latter Bulgarian rulers have been taking made their own re-assimilation into the empire even easier. So some of that sort of Hellenic, Byzantine, certainly Orthodox underpinning to this nation had already been there, and it actually made their integration far easier as a result.
Absolutely. So, so moving on.
Can I give us a brief extract of the Battle of Kleidion, if I may?
Sure. Just in terms of like what's next for the stream, I think
Sure.
In terms of like the military victory, I think Manzikert is the one I really want to discuss, because I really want to go into the Turkification of Anatolia. And because we're already an hour and a half in, I fear that almost too much detail in this will lead us going to three.
I merely want to talk about the numbers regarding the blinding, because I got a feeling there's a bit of urban mythology about this. And there's a very good book here called Byzantium Triumphant, which is by an author, Julian Romain. And I think in this sort of world that we occupy, we can sometimes be a little preoccupied with memes and urban legends, and the eyes of all these prisons got taken out, how badass. And there's a nice little couple of paragraphs here that just summarize how this actually went down with the prisoners, and allow me just to say this. The Byzantines blinded people using a number of methods, but the preferred procedure was the use of red-hot iron to burn out the eyeballs of the victims. Depending on the intent of the execution, the blinding could be complete and final, but also might just blind temporarily. Presumably, Basil's executioners made quick judgments in their actions, really blinding some, injuring some others. It takes us to the question of numbers. Skalitses gives the figure for blinded Bulgarian prisoners as 15,000. However, following Herodotus' method, he offers the figure attached to they say, rather than vouching for it specifically. If the number of prisoners was 15,000, then Samuel's whole army was at least 20,000 men. The logistics of moving masses of men through the Balatsisa-Osogovo Valley at this time strongly disagrees with such a magnitude of forces. The Byzantine numerical structure might explain this problem. Using the classical Greek numerical system, the Byzantine expressed numbers with the letters of the alphabet, digits 1 to 9 with the first 9 letters, 10 to 90 with the next 9 letters, and 100 to 900 with the third set of 9 letters, with some unused but remembered archaic letters to make the numerical system of 27 figures. Thousands resulted from making a stroke in front of and lower than the first letter number. So increasing a figure from hundreds to thousands was rather easy. Basil II had a problem with the engagement at Kleidion. Since 976, the Byzantines had been fighting the Bulgarian insurrection. After 1004, almost 30 years later, the war had finally simmered down to local and minor incursions and occasional skirmishes. Now, however, in 1014, the war had suddenly flamed up once again. The city had enough of the war and its taxes. Basil and Constantine did not look good in the eyes of the peasantry and the tax base. Being unable to muster a sizable number of mercenaries, whilst the Battle of Kleidion was a fine tactical victory, the need for the battle was a strategic defeat for Basil. His long-term strategy ended up looking faulty. We may imagine that Basil actually captured some 1,500 of Samuel's toughest warriors. He blinded those who looked the most vicious, singeing the eyes of the rest, and only blinding one eye out of 10 to lead the rest back home. That way the prisoners would cease to be a problem. This was a way of turning fighters into tax-paying farmers to convince the city that he was doing all that could be done for the war. The emperor saw to it that the figure of 1,500 became 15,000 and increased the magnitude of his victory from a rather nominal tactical exercise to a great strategic triumph. So in some ways, it was both a domestic policy to inflate his victory at home, to inflate his own prestige, meanwhile used externally as essentially a coup, as a propaganda to inflate his notoriety and his viciousness. So what he's sort of saying in the book is essentially, rather than being one out of 10 out of 15,000 being blinded, it's more likely to be 1 out of 1,500.
Yes, and I think that makes sense in terms of the tactics of terror and being very effective in subduing whole populations. There's just one thing people in the chat have been saying that I can hear it too. There's I'm not sure whether it's a Discord notification on your end, Marcus, but it comes through about once every 10 seconds. There's a little beep.
Okay, I've closed Discord. Sorry, I didn't realize that at all. Thank you, everyone.
Right.
I didn't realize.
No, it's fine. I just brought it up because people in the chat began to mention it. So moving on quickly. So we can try and summarize this. Yes, Basil then conducts various it's not just expanding westwards, as we saw from the map. The eastern provinces have expanded greatly as well. He's expanding into Georgia and Armenia. I think again, this is a bit of a double-edged sword because it's outstretching the resources of the empire, and it's actually weakening the fellow Christian domains of Armenia and Georgia at a time which is, the Seleucids are beginning to consolidate in the Khwarezm region, and they're going to begin attacking in the 1040s. So Basil, was also planning to annex Sicily shortly before his death, and his death aborts this. And really, as you can see on this map, compared to all the previous maps we've seen, Basil represents the zenith of the empire and the zenith of the golden age of the empire. He's basically supreme ruler from Calabria in Italy, Croatia in the Balkans, all the way to Armenia in the east and Antioch in the south.
And for about 50 years as well, he rules,
yes,
right?
For about 50 years as well. So this is a major period of consolidation and expansion, building upon the economic success and the soft power successes of the 9th century and 10th century golden age. But sadly, this doesn't last very long because, as you mentioned, he had a brother, Constantine the Eighth. Basil himself had no male offspring. So not only does Constantine the Eighth then become emperor, and of course he's very ineffective in terms of actually succeeding Basil, and so the military campaigns are shut down, and the army has moved beyond the tagma scheme into towards these professional soldiers and these mercenaries, which massively increased military expenditure, which ironically also lead to the weakening of the empire in certain crucial positions as well. We have the rule of women, and we have the fall of the Macedonian dynasty. So
just on that point, very briefly, just about the army, just very quickly, if I may. Two things occur at the death of Basil. After the defeat of the Bardas rebellions of Skleros and Phocas, if I'm not mistaken, he does not appoint another Domestikos of the East, because that was considered by many to be just a stepping stone to power. And when I spoke about that further, the breaking down, not the breaking down, but the slight segmentation of the thematic system, to incorporate some of the new cities and territories that have been conquered and what have you. The Phocas family, the Skleros family, you have these large clans that had accrued large estates in Anatolia, and they were using this power as a means to be able to seize the throne in Constantinople. And so, kind of to sort of answer what Columba was asking, 20 minutes ago, half an hour ago, the emperors on purpose start to neglect the themes, because these would-be emperor generals are using them as power base, but they're ignoring the themes at a most critical point, as we will see in the next 50 years, with dire consequences for the empire.
Yes, and we're basically setting the scene, the countdown towards Manzikert, which is the one of the ultimate disasters of the empire. So yes, in terms of understanding, why the themes were neglected, and yes, what you're pointing out that the Domestikos of the East was a stepping stone to power. I mean, this was the case, all the way up until since the reign of Justinian, who had occupied that position before, succeeding to the post of his father, up to his uncle Justin. So we have the reigns of I really don't want to get too much into detail here, but we have basically the reign of Zoe Porphyrogenitor and later her sister Theodora, who basically ruled in all but name and took male consorts who were not of the Macedonian dynasty, and adopted sons, in the case of Zoe adopting Constantine the Ninth, to basically rule as the effective military side of the empire, whilst the empresses controlled the court from the Gynaeceum. And this
you had men like Michael the Fourth, right, who were basically sort of toy boys, court lovers, who were just
essentially they were just soldiers to cement the empress's reign whenever they needed a military commander on the front line. So the Macedonian dynasty succeeds through these two women, but when Zoe dies in 1050 and Theodora dies in 1056, none of them have produced a male heir, so the dynasty dies with them. And then we have,
and I'm pretty sure one of them, Theodora, they did try, and she got married again at like 50 or something.
Yes. They become desperate, and as you can see with Zoe is 72 when she dies, and both of them are childless towards the end of the reign. So yes, the dynasty comes to an end through the inability of the Macedonian dynasty to produce a male heir, and this is when we have one of the most important events of the entire medieval history, which is the Great Schism. We already mentioned the Photine Schism, and what's significant is that all of the issues pertaining to the differentiation between the Eastern and the Western churches and the power of the Pope and the Patriarch have already been established, and they've already been established for 200 years at this point. So there isn't actually anything really new in terms of the actual theological disputes, apart from perhaps that of the leavened bread and the Eucharist. So really, I see the Great Schism as you can see a continuation of this political struggle, because the theological struggle and the theological disputes, beginning with Photius the Great, vis-a-vis the emperor. I mean, it's obvious to me that this is an extension of a political struggle, because we've already had the end of the Byzantine papacy, we've had the end of the Tusculum papacy and the Secalum Obscurum. We have the reform popes, being placed on the throne by the Holy Roman emperors, and beginning with Clement II. And this
no more Theophylacty.
There's no more Theophylacty. So we have these.
But I mean, there is an extent to which, I mean, it's hard to exactly delineate where the theological and the political ends in a situation like this, because
the principal argument is this is papal supremacy, which is a theological and obviously a political point. But this isn't just aimed at the East. This is also aimed at the Holy Roman emperors. So you can say that the Great Schism was also one of the fatalities of the popes adopting, papal supremacy against the imperial power of the Holy Roman emperors, as much as the power of the Eastern emperors at the same time. Simply, the schism with the Eastern Empire was made possible by all of these theological disputes, which had gone, unresolved really since Leo the Isaurian began the iconoclastic controversy.
Yes, because I mean, there's a total difference in the church as well, because obviously the church in the East is totally subordinate to the emperor, and so there's no. I mean, obviously you have the the Patriarch of Constantinople, but
yes, we mentioned that.
But it's not as if there's this idea that the Patriarch of Constantinople is sort of through essence always going to be the prime authority. There are people who argue that other patriarchs or other bishops can have a position of importance at some time, as opposed to the permanent leadership of the Pope in Rome.
Yes, just in terms of a comparison. I mean, even in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the Patriarch isn't superior to the Pope. Rather, the Pope is considered to be the first among the bishops, as opposed to the supreme universal ruler of the temporal and secular and spiritual realms. And the Patriarch is basically considered to be, on a similar footing, but ultimately subservient to the Pope. However, the Pope is, going way beyond the idea of first among equals to adopting this idea of, universal supremacy over Christendom, which will, culminate in the reign of Pope Boniface VIII. But just in terms of a direct catalyst for the Great Schism is the Norman conquest under Robert Guiscard and the sons of Tancred, because when we have the reconquest of, as you can see on this map, Bari and Calabria, before we have the consolidation of the new kingdom of Sicily, the popes, the Normans, originally allied with the popes, begin forcing these areas which have been part of the Greek Rite for centuries now to adopt the Latin Rite or suffer the expulsion of their clergy and the closure of their churches. And this causes a major retaliation when the then Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Corelarios, begins to close Latin churches in Constantinople. And this prompts a papal legate of Leo IX to visit the Patriarch to advocate that he accept papal supremacy. And this is beyond this. This isn't just an idea about papal supremacy as well, but he's wanting the Patriarch's support, ironically, against the Normans, because whilst the Normans are imposing the Latin Rite in the formerly Byzantine possessions, the Normans are becoming a secular threat to the papal states, and would do so. And obviously this would culminate in the reign of Frederick II of the Kingdom of Sicily and of the Holy Roman Empire at the same time. The popes were always worried about being militarily threatened by the new threat of the Normans in the south. But Michael, doesn't concede on either of these points, and this results in his excommunication. And what is different from this, because of course this isn't the first time that various popes and patriarchs have anathematized or excommunicated each other. What differentiates this from the Ascension Schism, during the reign of the Monophysite Emperor Anastasius, or the Photine Schism, where Photius had basically stood on principle and said, we are denouncing the Pope and his revisions through the Filioque, is that this schism was never formally resolved. The excommunication was never formally lifted. And so this Great Schism actually lasts until today. There has been no formal theological reconciliation over these issues, even though the political reasons no longer exist for the Great Schism. The theological issues, such as the Filioque, remain to this day.
And we're far, far removed from those circumstances which created it.
Yes, exactly. So yes, this is the origin of, as you can see on this map, the division of the Byzantine Commonwealth, the Byzantine Rite, even though we also have the Slavonic Rite, which is subordinate to the Patriarch of Constantinople, and then we have the Catholic Christian Rite, even though, as we see, these little areas of blue are going to quickly be lost. In terms of
it is interesting how the rites correspond with these really old the really old presence of the Greek colonies in the south. There's still this in the bottom of the Italian peninsula, there's still this Greek identity.
Well, what's remarkable about this map is if you look at a map of, with the exception of the grey, and Turkey, when you look at the European possessions, the map is basically the same. I mean, the delineation of Ukraine and Belarus as the frontier of orthodoxy, all we see is that the grey has basically been filled in, or some blue areas have been lost. So in the grey in the north, all of this is going to be Catholic. The grey in the east, all of that is going to become Orthodox with a spattering of Islam. Turkey is going to be lost. But in terms, even looking at the map of Hungary, where we have Romania, and we used to have, up until the Second World War, a Hungarian, even German enclave in Siebenbürgen, which were Catholic. All of these little
Slacky land,
yes, all of these areas, these religious differentials are going to remain more or less constant for the next 1,000 years, which is pretty incredible considering it how stable this schism was.
And also strangely too, these lines of religious differentiation aren't all that different from that, that big line we mentioned a couple of streams ago, that sort of break between Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking in the Roman Empire. They're not that far apart.
No. And I would say that at the time, the schism wasn't perceived to be this epochal event. It was perceived along the lines of the earlier ones, but unfortunately, the schism was followed by, which we'll get into in the next stream, the reasons why there was no reconciliation. We have the massacres and the Crusades.
Yes.
But, save that for next.
This issue, you can say that this is the inevitable result of both churches seeking independence from one another, theologically and politically, the cultural differences, the political differences. But this is just a preamble for things getting worse. This isn't the definitive split, no, we're enemies. This is simply setting up an environment in which relations are going to deteriorate over the next 200 years. But in terms of the Macedonian dynasty, the Macedonian dynasty had, picked Michael VI as the heir of Theodora, but he was very quickly defeated by the first Komnenian Emperor, Isaac Komnenos, at the Battle of Hades. But regrettably for the empire, Isaac Komnenos was very old when he became emperor and didn't last very long. He was only emperor for 2 years, and already during that time, because he'd attempted to take money away from the monasteries, the patriarch who had been excommunicated by Pope Leo IX had tried to usurp him by summoning a synod to depose him, Michael Korolarios. And so Isaac basically concedes, after defeating the Hungarians and the Pechenegs, he retires in favor of, as you mentioned, one of the families, Constantine Doukas, the 10th. And as a result, we probably have one of the last effective emperors who could have dealt with the crisis in the East. And corresponding with the same time, the Normans finally begin to take over all the possessions. But, they won't take Bari, which is the last possession in the Byzantine Empire in Italy until 1071, which is really the hell year of the Byzantine Empire, because this gets us on to the prelude to.
It would be quite appropriate to call it its Anni Terribile.
Yes, the Annus Horribilis, a generally sort of terrible year in terms of losses on all fronts. So getting here, I think Constantine Doukas, again, he fails to prevent these Seleucid raids, and we have further losses in Italy. And then we have Romanus IV Diogenes, who is elected emperor, and he begins to undertake this massive expedition against Alp-Arslan, and just to set up the Seleucids, for people who don't know. The Seleucid dynasty was descended from one Seleuc Beg, who was an Oghuz Turk who had served under the Khazars and then moved to Khwarezm, which is this region around the Aral Sea in modern-day Uzbekistan. And from this power base, they began to expand south and quickly take over vast regions in Khorasan, which is this area in eastern Iran, which is around the city of Mashhad, and Herat, which is now in Afghanistan. And from this power base, they expanded into Mesopotamia and Iran, supplanting the Buyid dynasty, which I mentioned, under Sultan Togrul Beg. And here the caliphs nominally recognized them as rulers of this region. The caliphs were still nominally the supreme rulers of Islam, but in reality all military and actual authority was held by the Seleucid Turks. And this is when they begin to expand towards the Byzantine Empire. So in 1048 they attack and are repelled, but in 1068 Alp-Arslan begins attacking Byzantium again, and so we have Manzikert. And so really, I want to ask you, Marcus, several questions. First of all, just a quick summary of Manzikert. And I really want to understand the effects of this, because from where I'm standing, as you can see on this map, this horrific map where, Anatolia is basically gone within 1071 to 1081. The entirety of Anatolia is essentially overrun with the Seleucid Turks. And I want to understand how this was even possible, considering that throughout the Muslim conquests, the Anatolian themes have been the source of manpower and the source, basically the principal source of the economy and revenue for the empire. And within 10 years, this province of the empire, which had been, consolidated again and again and again with all of these fortresses, had fallen so quickly, basically undoing, a 400-year defensive line.
Well, before I start, I'll just get my handkerchief and dab a tear away.
Pour one out for the
boys. The interesting thing is, Manzikert's interesting in many ways. One, it's not an annihilation battle. It's not a Cannae. It's not an Arausio. It's not an Abritus. It's not an Adrianople. In fact, the casualties suffered here are actually no worse. In fact, they're not even as bad as the defeat suffered by Nicephorus I at Pliska, and what was the preceding battle in Bulgaria to Pliska? In Bulgaria?
Yes, I won't be able to remember off the top of my head.
The listeners and you both know what I'm talking about, and Columba.
Yeah.
But like that, they were battles which annihilated the greater part of a Roman army. Considerably, right? Manzikert isn't that. The thing at Manzikert is, and I notice there's a few people throwing shade on the Ducas family, and yes, that's entirely justified. Be damned the Ducoi for their role. So the response by Romanus Diogenes is sort of stimulated by the loss of Ani, which is the capital of the latest province which has been integrated into the empire, because just prior to 1071, the Byzantines essentially absorbed the rump Armenian state into the empire. It becomes the theme of Vaspurakan, which is sort of encompasses Lake Van, what is Lake Van today, and the cities of Ani, Ovan, of a few cities in that region, Kars, make up the Vaspurakan region. And almost as soon as this rump kingdom is absorbed into the Byzantine sphere, Alp Arslan arrives with these Seljuk Turks, and Ani is lost almost immediately. Within a couple of years, it's lost. And these raids perpetually start to happen into Anatolia. They're very reminiscent of those Arab incursions which are being launched from Cilicia and from northern Syria. In the early Abbasid period, when the Arabs launched two attacks on Constantinople, that same sort of almost annual campaign into Anatolia. This is a rebirth of those Arab tactics almost.
It seems to be linked into just such a historical cycle. I mean, going all the way back to Herodotus when he talks about the Magians and how the Persians took control of the Median Empire. It's like we have this grand empire of the East that again and again is conquered by horse people who come from either the steppe or the desert. It's just this, and then they sweep and take over the sort of block or the civilizational block. It just seems to be a recurring historical cycle.
Correct, but it's sort of Anatolia for the first time since the Achaemenid period is conquered from the east rather than from the west. I mean, you got to think Anatolia has been a solid Greek possession now since the Empire of Alexander. And when I say Hellenic, I'm talking from a cultural aspect, because obviously the Alexander realm is sort of divided between a Persian Parthian sphere and a Roman sphere. Anyway, in regards to this specifically, the Turks start making incursions into Anatolia. They raid Caesarea, which is in the real heart of the province of Cappadocia and the theme of Carsianon. They attack other cities in the region. They attack Sanliurfa, which I couldn't remember its name last week, but it's Edessa. Is one day Sanliurfa. They attack Marash. They attack these Amida. They attack a whole bunch of cities in what is sort of today's eastern Turkey in the eastern part of Anatolia, and Diogenes assembles this army to attack it. But this army, and I mentioned last week how this thematic system is established, so that the emperor departs Constantinople with the better part of his tagma, and then collects these thematic troops along the way. The thematic troops he does collect are of a much lesser quality than even 50 years ago, never mind 150 years ago from his point in time. And even the tagma are not of the quality of what they once were. The excubitores, the hetairoi, the numeroi are not of a standard to what they once were. They've been weakened by this indecision, by this instability since the sort of the collapse of the heyday of the Macedonian dynasty, since really the death of Basil and of Constantine the Eighth. And Diogenes heads east. Now, the army itself is commanded by a host of different commanders, which is in part its weakness. The army is led by Romanus IV, Romanus Diogenes, and in command of the army is a loyalist, Nikephoros Bryennios, who actually has a sort of a role later on. He becomes, I believe, Nikephoros Bryennios marries Anna Komnenos later on. Oh no, that might be his son, Nikephoros Bryennios the Younger. Sorry. You have Theodore Elates, who commands a portion of the army. Andronicus Ducas. Now, this guy is the villain of the battle. He commands essentially the rear troops, the reinforcements for the center.
And the Ducoi are an earlier sort of imperial family who have ambitions of their own, correct?
And the Ducoi have married into previous imperial families, and themselves also marry into the Komnenoi later on. So, and the Ducoi actually tend to come, like even in the Paleologoi period, the Ducoi come up. They're very established and sort of very powerful family with enduring influence across the empire for quite a long time. Like even the Breakaway, the Epirite, despotate of Epirus, is a Komnenos Dukos, for instance, right? Another part of the army is led by Joseph Tarchionotes, and there's a contingent of Normans under, what's his name? I've just gone blank. I think Roussel de Bouillon, I think his name is. I can't remember exactly.
And the Turkish army is led by one leader, one king or
one
general.
Leader, right?
Yes, I mean you see that a lot when you look at Napoleon's famous Ulm campaign, right? I mean the decisive one leader versus the indecision of 4 or 5. Yeah, it's a big deal.
Well, in some ways it works. Like there are battles in the past where this has worked for the Byzantines, but it has to be led by a strong king and it has to be led by loyal subordinates. Neither of these are true at Manzikert. Sorry, the 500 Frankish Norman mercenaries are led by Roussel de Baliou. That's who I couldn't remember. Now, what happens at Manzikert is the Byzantine army attacks the Turks in sort of there's almost like 3 separate battles that occurs. The Byzantine right, led by Nikephoros Bryennios, actually throws the Turks back, repels them. The center, which is led by Romanos and contains the Hetairoi and the Varangian Guard, pushes the Turks back. They suffer losses, but because it's led by Alp-Arslan, they retreat in order. Right? It's not a defeat for them. I mean, they suffer losses, but it's not a catastrophic defeat for the Turks. What happens is that the Turkish left flank, which has been defeated by Bryennios, wheels around to support the Turkish right, and the Turks send reinforcements to their right, encircle the Byzantine left, and destroy it. I'm just trying to remember who led that flank. I think it might have been Elates, I can't remember. But the Byzantine left is encircled and destroyed, and then it's that portion of the Turkish force, along with Alp-Arslan, sort of wheeling back around with his center. They encircle Romanos and his Hetairoi, and you might say the competent element of the Targuma that have marched to at Manzikert. And the Varangian contingent basically fights to a man. The Hetairoi fight to the last man. Romanos is captured not before several messengers were sent to the rear guard to join them, and Andronicus Ducas marches off the battlefield before the battle's even ended, because he's got one mind on the throne. And as soon as he arrives in Constantinople, he says that Romanos is dead, which is not true because he's being captured. And there's a very infamous exchange between Romanus Diogenes and Alp-Arslan, where Romanos basically says to the Turkish king, I don't know what you call him, but the Turkish leader, and says, "I suppose you're going to kill me. You're going to torture me." And Alp-Arslan sort of says in his very merciful manner, he's like, "No, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do the most unexpected thing of all and release you. You're free to go back." But the problem is, in the aftermath of Manzikert, even on the eve of the battle, and the way that Andronicus Ducas has advertised this to the Byzantine public on Constantinople, it's already seen as a disaster of astonishing magnitude. And Romanos is actually treated worse by his own compatriots. Essentially, upon arrival in Constantinople, he's the most unpopular emperor in years and decades, and he's almost immediately arrested and blinded, and he dies of his wounds very quickly. But to answer Apostolic's question about the rapid takeover of Turkey, for those who know, I'm sure most people who watch your channel are aware of Kings and Generals. I actually have a really good video on this that talks about some of the more dynamic aspects of the Turks and the migrations and their adaptability to the Turkish plateau. And I know we run already at 2 hours, so I don't want to go on and on about the various factors. But there is an important military thing to consider here, which facilitates this takeover of Anatolia very much for the Turks. And that is one of the generals who escapes is a man called Nikephoros Melisanos. Now, the Melisanos they're not as powerful as the Doukhoi, they're not as powerful as the Komnenoi, but they're still a major family, and they come from a relatively what would you say, like a prominent family of generals, kind of a bit like the Cortacuas family in the century before. Now, Nikephoros Melisanos actually was the general in command of the Turkic and the steppe contingent, which defected to Alp-Arslan at Manzikert. But what he does is marching back to Constantinople, he deploys what is left of his mercenary contingents, because not all of them defect, but and obviously some don't get taken to the battle. So what mercenary steppe contingents, Turkic contingents he does have, he leaves them to garrison these large cities in Anatolia, whether it's Iconium, whether it's Ankara, as the Greeks call it, cities such as Sinope, Gordion, Amorion, Atalaya, these really, really important strategic cities in the east, Caesarea even, are garrisoned by these troops who share a kinship with the Turks under Alp-Arslan. So as Nikephoros has made his way across Anatolia to go back to the capital, because he himself actually declares support for Michael the Seventh of the Doukas family, right? The moment Alp-Arslan marches into Anatolia at the head of this migratory wave and his armies, the troops that are garrisoning these cities share a loyalty with them. So they throw their gates open to Alp-Arslan. So even though the Turks don't have the technology or the siegecraft to take these cities by force, sort of inadvertently, Nikephoros Melisanos, even though a competent Byzantine general, and by all accounts, I mean, he did support the Doukhoi, but he's not a traitor to the nation, so to speak. He sort of inadvertently, by his actions, ensures the complete loss of Anatolia to the empire, and thus its death knell in some respects. Because if 1204 we might consider is the real fatal blow to Byzantium, the loss of Anatolia and the loss of these cities and the loss of the themes and the loss of these estates that produced the horses and the soldiers and the economic prosperity that guaranteed the empire, the after effects of Manzikert are disastrous. And like I said, the army wasn't wiped out. This isn't a Cannae, this isn't Abritus, this isn't an Arausio, this isn't an Adrianople. But it's the consequences and the after effects of Manzikert and the political instability that follows it. With the usurpation of the Doukhoi and then the counter usurpation of the Doukhoi and eventually the triumph of Alexios Komnenos in this power vacuum. It's those things in conjunction and together and occurring in a relatively short space of time in the face of a massive migration of Turks. And for the Turks, the Anatolian plateau is very reminiscent to home. For them, the heights of the Turkish plateaus are very suitable to their horse and their sort of semi-nomadic way of life. If anyone's been to Turkey, and I have, you travel between Ankara and Caesarea and Kayseri and Konya, modern day, what was Iconium. It's just flat grassland. It's perfect for rearing horses and for goats and for the way that the Turks would have lived back then. And so for them to adapt to this new geography, given the way that they lived in those days and the kind of people they were, they took to it, like a duck to water. And so it's all these factors in conjunction that just Anatolia is lost to the Turks in such a rapid space of time. Whereas, like you and both Apostolic and you have said, Columba, Anatolia resisted the Arabs for centuries. It was the bulwark, and it was just almost lost in a heartbeat. Do
you think another reason? Thank you for that, by the way. But do you think another reason for this was in some sense, the systems that had been built up in Anatolia were in some sense adapted to the situation where there was a lot of instability amongst, I mean, we've talked about Africa collapsing, and we've talked about the contest for power within the caliphates and what have you. So do you think that this sort of although it was temporary, this sort of strong unification and this, I guess, vitality, if we want to say that the Turks brought, the system that existed in Anatolia was not built to withstand that?
Hard question to ask. I don't want to pretend I have the answers to that entirely, because I don't. But if I can speculate slightly, I think in part you have a bit of a fatigue of the Byzantine population. There's, a lot of taxes have been raised in the preceding decades and centuries to fight these expensive wars, and even though the nation had prospered under the Macedonian dynasty, under Nicephorus and Zimisces and Basil II and what have you, there'd been this very strong rejuvenation, broadly speaking, of the empire. People just don't like to be oppressed and taxed. I know that sounds really bad. And the Turks bring a far more, I hate to say it, sort of carefree system. I know that sounds really lovey-dovey, but sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I haven't spoken for a very long time. But just to substantiate your point, I mean, to my mind, this again is very reminiscent of the Roman citizens in Italy who were prepared to tolerate Ostrogothic and then Langobard rule, so long as they were basically treated with a light hand and they weren't taxed so effectively. But I think the question I really want to ask you is, you mentioned, how the Turks have been willing to, open the doors and let the city and let the Turks in. What about, the urban resistance to this? Because there were many, as you mentioned, many Greek urban metropolises. How
that were predominantly Greek by great margin. Yes.
Yes. So how rapid was this colonization of the Anatolian plain? Because essentially, we have in very quick order, we have, I mean, what's also fascinating is that Arslan didn't even bother to directly continue the conquest. Instead, it's led by Suleiman ibn Katalmish, who establishes the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, obviously Rum being the Turkish name for Rome.
And invaded the Danishmends in the north.
Yes, and this will be established in Nicaea, and then you have, the collapse into these various Turkic beyliks. But how rapid was this consolidation? How many people are we talking about? What was the population of Anatolia at this time?
I don't want to take this stream too far off its relevant talking point, but just as something for people to consider, as a bit of a thought experiment. There's a reason why, for instance, in the modern day, genealogy is a contentious subject in modern day Turkey, is all I'll say. And if you travel across Turkey, what I'll say is this: the further east you go, let's just say the more traditional they appear, and the further you travel west, they look far more Hellenic. And the thing is, what I will say is that the eastern part of Anatolia, because even though there were some large cities in those areas, Edessa, Amida, Martinopolis, Theodosiopolis, etc., Telucia, etc., Germanicae. The countryside was obviously more sparsely populated because just based upon geography and topology and climate and what have you. And this is why I think those regions Turkified and Islamicized far more rapidly. I mean, for instance, by the time the forces of Barbarossa come through Anatolia, as a result of the Third Crusade, Iconium and its environs are probably majority Turkish. They're certainly majority Muslim, right? But the periphery of the Anatolian coastline, Pontus, Paphlagonia, what you might call Ionia, Lydia, Caria, etc. I'm using ancient region names now. Pisidia are still predominantly ethnically Greek and religiously Orthodox. And also because the Turks did settle primarily in that plain, in the Anatolian plain, when they arrived under sort of initially Upper Arsalan and then the beyliks that followed them in, because essentially, like you sort of said, these smaller tribes essentially went into Anatolia of their own initiative. They weren't really ordered in. They weren't led specifically. They kind of just went in of their own. And so this process begins, and sort of like Columba alluded to, and sort of like I was saying as well, like just the Turks weren't this bureaucratic imperial state that sort of micromanaged population.
Just you'll give us the jizya, you know, and it's very simple. And I do think, that's the point I was trying to get at earlier.
Which is why the hinterlands converted more rapidly and Turkified more rapidly, and this is why, like, even in later periods, like if you look at the pre-modern periods, because I know, Apostolic, you're very well learned about World War I and sort of that time period, other side of it. Constantinople, the turn of the previous century, was still more Christian than Muslim. Izmir, what was old Smyrna, was more Greek than it was Turkish.
Yes,
you still had enclaves.
Yes, I think I just want to hold this conversation. I think because we're going to be doing like a whole stream on this, hopefully. So I want to say this and finish this stream. But no, thank you very much for answering your point. And you have effectively answered my point, which is what we have this consolidation in the center. But I think again, it's just remarkable how we have this. You could say this reversal of more than 1,000 years of history, where you go back to this state where the Medians or the Hittites, for example, the horse people had controlled the interior, and the Greeks had controlled the periphery. They could control the coastal settlements. How this old state of affairs had basically returned.
Anatolia was fatal for them. Like that, losing the core territory and losing that short frontier proved fatal later on.
Yes, and I think we'll get onto that now. So you alluded to the civil wars and how Michael the Seventh, Ducos, was a complete failure. You had 4 attempted usurpations and 1 successful one, and that usurpation was basically put down, and he was replaced by Alexios Komnenos. We have the Komnenian Restoration, and I think again you mentioned Columba. What is the fundamental success of the Seleucs and the fundamental decline? Yes, they're able to conquer vast amounts of land, but very quickly the Seleuc Empire collapses. Even this idea of a united Seleuc Empire is really anathema, because it already during the reign of Alp Arslan begins to dissipate into these smaller Turkish principalities, and this is the Seleuc Sultanate of Rum, which lasts for the next 300 years until it basically becomes subordinate to the to the Mongols and will eventually dissipate into smaller beyliks. So there isn't some sort of consolidated like Turkish Empire like the Ottoman Empire. And I think what probably differentiates the Seleuc Empire from the Ottoman Empire is the Ottoman Empire basically basing them of a Islamic but also a Byzantine system of administration, unlike the Seleucs, who basically a nomadic empire, and they collapse very quickly. And this is where we have the reversal of fortunes, which is the First Crusade. So we mentioned in our stream about the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, Marcus, about how the Normans, not content, Robert Guiscard, to consolidate southern Italy, began invading the empire proper, and attacked Dyrrhachium, took over Corfu and began to invade Thessaly, and this was put to an end by Robert Guiscard's death in 1085. But then we begin to see a brief military revival, and by now, so hopefully I have a map. Actually, I don't have a map for this period, but this is slightly better, I say. We have the restoration. The restoration of military fortunes, but again, this map is at the later period, the Komnenian Restoration. So the Seleuc Sultanate would have been much.
That looks at the end of John II.
Yeah, so this would have, the Seleuc Sultanate would have been much larger and controlled much of the West, because this is after the Restoration.
Yeah. For the sake of the chat, for those who don't know, because I know not everyone will be a Byzantinist in this chat, but you see Alexius I here, who takes the throne in 1056. Consider that the Seljuks have the entire Asiatic part of what is modern day Turkey. That sort of blue portion that's in Asia Minor was all Seljuk by the time Alexius becomes emperor, more or less.
Yes, and so yes, just to quickly summarize, because hopefully we'll be done, in about 10-20 minutes. Alexios, is able to defeat the Pechenegs, who, again, the proverbial, threat from Crimea, later become the Crimean Khanate. And this is where we have the main turning point, which is the First Crusade. This is coming off the backdrop of the investiture controversy with Henry IV, and him appointing his own anti-pope, and Pope Urban II, is the true pope in opposition to the emperor's anti-pope. And to consolidate his authority, he is beseeched by Alexios to help in restoring the Christian possessions in Anatolia. And Urban II, at the Council of Piacenza, realized that this is a golden opportunity to consolidate his own authority as, claim to Christian universalism, Christian supremacy, by organizing a crusade to liberate the Holy Land, also correspondingly to help the Byzantine Empire. So all of these things, the investiture controversy and the aftermath of the Battle of Manzikert, culminate to create the perfect environment for the Crusades, because of course, as you mentioned, the Seleucids, they come in, they're originally very militarily successful, but politically they collapse. The Fatimids have also collapsed during this point, so there couldn't have actually been a more perfect time for the West to exert a military presence.
And we have the famous Deus Volta episode, right? God wills it.
Yes. Yeah. In terms of like organizing a specific like crusade stream, I'm not quite sure how we're going to organize that. But again, this is going to be very much from the Byzantine perspective. And from the Byzantine perspective, Alexios is less concerned about reclaiming the Holy Land than he is very concerned about restoring these Byzantine possessions in Anatolia. So
one might say survival.
Yes. Well, I mean, one of the you mentioned how fatal it was, but I think it also needs to be mentioned that, look at this map. The success of Basil and his reconquest of Bulgaria was such that he didn't need to concern himself with, another frontier in Bulgaria, that the Balkan possessions were relatively secure. So perhaps better than any other time, in terms of the Battle of Manzikert, the empire was actually better able to withstand the loss of Anatolia, because they've been able to massively expand and consolidate their position in the Balkans at the same time.
Certainly the loss of Anatolia, maybe 150 years before this date, would have definitively been the end of the empire, I think you can say.
So
like you say, the campaigns of Basil II bring the Balkans back into the fold and allow allow Alexius and his heirs a launching pad from which to reconquer Anatolia, which nearly occurred.
Yes, exactly. We talk about the Komnenian Restoration, and this is why, we've included this in the Golden Age, because still at this point, Constantinople is the largest city in the world and the most beautiful city in the world, which is the cultural center. It's the source of the Renaissance when the Crusaders are going to be passing through here, the late
still
12th
a massive
century.
Conduit of trade.
And it's a massive conduit of trade and international diplomacy at the same time. And the emperor is still able to amass these colossal resources from the consolidation of the Balkans at the same time. So so the Golden Age is still continuing, and it'll continue really until the Battle of Myriokephalon, when we have the definitive check against the Byzantine reconquest of this region. But yes, the First Crusade is basically used by Alexios as a means to reconquer territory, and in return for allowing safe passage and guides throughout Anatolia, the Crusaders begin taking cities such as Nicaea.
And just if I can briefly bookmark something here, this is an important thing, again, for those in the chat who are not, nutted out military historians who, don't have encyclopedias in their head or who just aren't familiar with the subject, is, the Crusades is something in our modern day, which is something we're gaslighted with constantly, right? And I don't want to make this about politics. I want to keep this very brief, but consider that the First Crusades are initiated by a Byzantine emperor in the East who has suffered a massive defeat in commas at Manzikert. Anatolia, a Christian Greek locality which has been European for several hundreds of years, millennia at this point, sends an appeal to the Pope, who is essentially the only binding force in Europe in the absence of a Roman Empire, for assistance. That is essentially the groundwork. That is the foundation stone of the First Crusade occurring. It's not like some frothed up zealots gathering in, Clermont-Ferrand and, throwing Bibles around and donning their armor and marching crazily to the Middle East. It's far more complicated than that, and there's a backstory to it.
There were frothed up crazies. Let's not.
Well, yes.
We love the frothed up crazies here.
But it wasn't like an action out of the ether. There's a backstory to it, and the loss of Anatolia and the crippling of the Byzantine Empire and the appeal by Constantine of Alexius to the West is the trigger for it.
Yes, and I think in terms of putting this in context, because it's very understandable within the given context of the period, my only surprise is that because the Byzantine Empire had been so successful in holding the eastern frontier at bay for so long against the threat of Islam, it had been the bulwark of Christianity in the East. My surprise is that this didn't happen sooner. But again, this also is involved in the very particular context of the investiture controversy, of the papal supremacy, and of the loss of Anatolia. All of these events culminating at the same time to give the the casus belli to allow for the reconquest. And Manuel is not only concerned, Alexios is not only concerned with the reconsolidation of territory, but he also wants to exert suzerainty over the outtremor principalities, most of which are going to be led by Norman or Frankish lords or English lords, etc.
And his son undertakes that with considerable success after him.
Yes, so we have, first of all, the Treaty of Deauville, where Antioch, as you can see in the north, is basically made into a vassal state, a possession, more or less, under the suzerainty of the empire, although the Principality of Antioch will retain its autonomy. John II is the son you mentioned, and he's probably one the greatest of the Byzantine emperors. He's exceptionally a calm, pious ruler, and many commentators note his elegance and his temperament. But he defeats the Pechenegs again, and from 1130 onwards, he leads a campaign to restore Asia Minor, and reconnecting all of these territories along the north. So the entire coastline, connecting the empire along Trebizond, expanding into the interior, recapturing Sicilia in the south, and then in terms of extending his ambitions, he wants to basically bring about the unity of the outtremor Crusader principalities under Byzantine, a nominal command. The only issue is that the Frankish lords, the outtremor lords, don't want this. They want to retain their independence, and also they want to maintain their ties to the See of Rome, and not the religious influence of Constantinople. So
Correct,
many attempts to bring about the unity of the outtremor principalities under the Eastern Roman Empire, which could have been very effective for Christendom as a whole, were denied between the internal religious and you can say ethnic schisms between the Frankish lords and the Latin Rite versus the Greek Rite.
Because at this point in time, we have to take into consideration, from a contemporaneous standpoint, from where we are now, the Great Schism is, in our lifetimes, will be a millennium away. I mean, for these people, it happened, within a couple of decades of their lives, of these events.
One could argue it's a very
fresh
happening.
Thing. Well, exactly. Like, it's a very fresh thing in their consciousness. And I mean, if you're a Crusader Frankish knight, or petty lord, or even king of Jerusalem or whatever, you don't want to be in league with the Emperor of Constantinople, who is schismatic to the church in Rome. It's diabolical.
Yes, dismissively known as the Emperor of the Greeks rather than the Emperor of the Romans. And this again is where you get.
It's not just anywhere that you're holding as well, right? I mean, it's Jerusalem, so yes. there's that added element as well.
Yes, and the irony is probably this is the last time where you could have had any sort of plausible attempt to restore the pentarchy, namely having Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and potentially Alexandria all under the same Holy See. But, this is frustrated, and the Great Schism is, of course, the main sticking point. The fact that there is an emperor in the West and there is an emperor in the East is a sticking point. The fact that we have had this, transition from the Romans to the Romaioi, the Greekification of the empire, all of these factors, compound to create this mutual mistrust. And really, you can say the disdain for Byzantine studies, really, throughout most of history until recently, comes from the xenophobia sort of produced during this region, which only expands. But really, that's going to be a talk principally for next time. Just in terms of rounding this up, obviously we talk about John II, and sadly his reign is cut short by a inadvertent hunting accident where he dies of an infection from an arrow, and his fourth son Manuel Komnenos becomes emperor. On the one hand, again, Manuel is hated by the Crusaders for supposedly hindering them, but it should be mentioned that he successfully permitted the Second Crusade throughout his territories, with virtually without incident. The argument against Manuel Komnenos is that he was more concerned with, consolidating the Christian principalities under his control than actually defending the crusade. And of course, the Second Crusade was a complete disaster.
Yeah, he didn't offer any assistance, right?
Well, that's not true, because as I said, he facilitated it, and his troops he wanted suzerainty over Edessa. Edessa was an effective buffer state between the Muslims and
the county of Edessa.
The county of Edessa, and so the loss of the county of Edessa was an actual major blow to the Byzantine Empire. So again, the fates of the outtremor Crusader states and the Byzantine Empire went hand in hand. But again, it was contributing to this mutual distrust. It didn't also help that the Second Crusade was utterly incompetent, tried a siege of Damascus, which was lifted just several days centuries later. And then, the Crusaders from this point, after the spectacular success of the First Crusade, they begin to lose. And of course, Jerusalem will be lost in 1186, to Salah al-Din, who begins, after the ruins of the Fatimid dynasty, creates the Ayyubid Sultanate. But just in terms of Manuel Komnenos, invariably after, trying to help the Crusaders, he is again concerned with expanding the empire into the interior, driving out the Seljuks and reconsolidating the empire in its former core possession, which is Anatolia. And this is checked definitively at the Battle of Myriokephalon, which was, a major ambush in 1176. And, even though it doesn't lead to the dramatic effects of Manzikert, it doesn't lead to, any loss of territory in the short term, and it doesn't even have that much of a, serious effect on the army. It is basically the last attempt, a serious effort was made by the Byzantines to drive the Turks out. And from that point on, the Turks are going to be there. Their presence is going to be definitive, and it's just going to grow until, the modern day where we have the modern state of Turkey.
It sort of breaks this momentum that they had sort of built up during this.
It ends the Komnenian Restoration. The Restoration only sort of goes so far, and and sadly it's unable to completely undo the effects of the defeat of Manzikert. It's basically a half restoration, but nevertheless, the empire is much stronger in 1176 than it had been, at the beginning of 1081. So, the Komnenoi were, one of the more successful of all the Byzantine dynasties.
Considering the circumstances.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely. And one thing to take into account too, if I can just give because I know time's a consideration, I'll compress this as best as I can, because I think these three emperors deserve to sort of be summarized in this way, is that Alexius, in the path of the Crusaders, because he does send a general Tatikios to sort of shadow the Crusader force of the First Crusade, and they recapture a number of cities in the mainland. Very famously, like you said, Apostolic, they do conquer Nicaea off the bat, and they march across Anatolia. And even though the First Crusade suffers quite considerable privations and reversals on the way, they capture Antioch. They march down the Levantine coast. They eventually capture Jerusalem. Is it Christmas Day 1099 they capture Jerusalem?
It's Christmas Day, yeah.
Christmas Day, yeah. And so, it works out. But even after the First Crusade had been sort of successfully won, Alexios, even though he's he's fighting the Normans and the Pechenegs of the north, he actually still is prosecuting a Byzantine Seljuk war in Anatolia. He quite famously, and it's an often forgotten battle, he fights the Battle of Philiomelion in the interior, which is modern day Akshehir, which is not far from I think it's somewhere between Dorileon and Iconion, modern day Konya. He actually penetrates the interior of the Seljuk Sultanate, and sort of he fights on their turf, beats them with a formation of his own devising. Actually, Anna Komnena talks about it in the Alexiad. They call it a Patataxis, which is it's almost like, strange enough, much like sort of the British squares, if you can imagine it, at Waterloo, like infantry squares with archers on the inside rather than
rifles. So a way to deal with their deficiency in cavalry, basically.
The ability to fight off light skirmishing cavalry with heavy infantry protecting archers shooting upwards of the squares with mixed heavy and light Byzantine cavalry interspersed between the squares. It's actually quite a genius thing that he conceived of. And they begin the process of evacuating Greek and Christian refugees from the interior of Anatolia to the coasts, which accelerates that process of Turkification and the Greek reinforcement of these coastal peripheries, right? And the second person that needs to be mentioned is John, which is the father of Manuel and the son of Alexios. Now, John is an often overlooked emperor, and it's so sad that we can only mention him quite literally in passing. John the More, they call him Kaleo Ionis, which is John the Beautiful, even though he was considered to be the ugliest man of the medieval period. That's an epithet given to his sort of the condition of his soul or his being.
Yeah.
He's quite literally one of the few medieval, or maybe possibly the only one, who never put a single person to death or torched anybody. He is an absolute paragon of virtue, and that is universally attested to both sides. Muslim
yes, I mean,
Greeks also say yes.
The other name, in addition to John the Beautiful, is of course John the Good. I mean,
John
really,
Good, yeah.
I mean, really, John the Second, Komnenos, he's basically like the Saint Louis of the Byzantine Empire, and probably it's the last great Christian emperor before the terminal decline. But just again, one mentioning it, in terms of other military successes before we end, just look at the map in the west. We also have the successful expansion along the Adriatic. We have successful wars against the Hungarians. So we have pushing the borders, further and further up the Danube. Again, the empire
John vassalized the Hungarians.
Yes, exactly. Even on the crown of the King Saint Stephen, you have a Byzantine emperor pictured there, indicating the submission of Hungary to the Byzantine emperor. Again, despite being part of the Latin Rite. So the success of the empire in the Balkans, basically achieved hegemony over the Balkans after having only 100 years being reduced effectively to a rump which could barely control Greece. Now it is extending and has this massive influence. I mean, the only sort of major unmitigated military disaster were all the various attempts, especially by Manuel Komnenos, to conspire with the emperor to retake Sicily, because the emperor hadn't given up on his ambition to take Sicily. After the loss of Bari in 1071, Sicily still had many Greek partisans, and obviously it was the key to Byzantine Italy. So
I would speculate still on majority at this point in time myself.
Sorry,
I would speculate a majority still at this time in history.
Yes, so again, very possible for the reconquest, but the dynasty of Tancred, of Roger II, was successful in being able to maintain their independence and of course exercise their incredibly powerful navy. So in all directions the empire was expanding, and really it's 1176 where we have the definitive check to the restoration. That's really where I want to leave this, and we'll talk about the collapse on the next stream. So just getting to super chats.
Can I just do a very brief?
Yes, a quick epilogue.
It must be very brief, my friend.
No, I was going to say, just to compare Manuel and John, right? So John himself was a very careful leader, but if you look at this map that AM actually has up here on the stream, he is the one who fully integrates Cilicia and Antioch with the body of the empire, because after the death of Alexius, the Turks actually invade in the southwestern direction, and cut off this eastern portion from the mainland. John immediately counterattacks through what is Lycia, through his Caria, through his Pisidia and Pamphylia, and retakes a bundle of cities in a very rapid space of time. But John never commits his army entirely in one place. He's aggressive, but he's also cautious simultaneously. And I believe he recovered something in the order of 100 cities across Paphlagonia, Cilicia, Pamphylia, Pisidia. He was also brave, despite being a very moral and a very calm and a sober leader and a very religiously orientated man. He was very brave. He often fought in battles himself. Of the sieges, he fought a number of pitched battles, and he personally conducted as many, I think, as 25 or 30 sieges himself. And in fact, it's his attempt. I think it's either capturing Aleppo. He actually conducts the siege personally, and it's the leaders of the Crusader states of Antioch and Edessa who are playing dice in their tent while John's doing the fighting for them. And this leads to that divide between Greek interests and Crusader interests, which Manuel himself, even though he's quite a pro-Crusader, I mean, he jousts with Catholic commanders and kings himself. But Manuel is more brazen. He's actually the youngest child. Because John accidentally cuts himself in a hunting incident and dies of septicemia, and it's actually on his deathbed he pronounces Manuel as his successor. Yeah. But Manuel, although he's a courageous leader and proves his courage at a young age, he's bolder, he's more rash, and he commits to several of these offensives against the Muslims that aren't, or against like the Turks and what have you, the Arabs, that aren't really well thought out. They're not measured, and he actually starts to sap the empire of strength with these ill-founded campaigns, which Apostolic has mentioned here, that lead up to the events of Myriokephalon, which, again, like Manzikert, doesn't destroy the army. It isn't a setback. It's not a massacre like the other battles I've mentioned previously, but it reverses the inertia of the campaign. It demonstrates the Byzantine inability to eject the Seljuks out of the Anatolian plateau, and more than anything, it's a psychological defeat. It's a moral defeat for the Byzantines. And even though the Byzantines turned back a Turkish invasion at Dorileon 2 years later with massive losses, because then Manuel gets old and feeble and dies, and his succession is questioned, and then we will get into this in the next stream. There's this unraveling that happens, and the Byzantines, because of events that happened after this period quite immediately, the empire will never recover, regrettably. There you go, Ian.
Thank you, and that's a wonderful epilogue for this stream, ending the Byzantine Golden Age.
I had to give John II his justice. He's
yes, and I agree. I think reading him, he's probably one of the greatest siege experts in all of medieval warfare. Just reading about how successful he was in recovering all of these cities. But yes,
and I think also an ideal ruler for a time which you could be excused for being cruel. He's actually a monumental figure in that. When people say, "Oh, would you be rather feared or loved, or would you be, Machiavelli or Caesar, or would you be this person or that person?" John is such an astonishing figure, but is overlooked by anybody who doesn't know Byzantine history. It's astonishing. He's a magnificent man, arguably the greatest man in history. I said it there online. There you go. You can write that on me. I said it.
Wonderful. So Marcus 588 for $8 Australian. Oh goody, the series just keeps getting better and better with the wonderful triumvirate. Here are some dollaroos, apostolic, much deserved. Well, thank you very much. And we have another super chat from Marcus 58 for $3 Australian. These guys deserve massive thanks. Awesome effort. Well, thank you very much. And that is the end of the super chat. So just one more comment to say thank you to all my Patrons. I'm slowly sort of increasing the numbers every week. I try and add the numbers. Again,
well done, guys.
Again, if you would like to subscribe, there is a link in the description. And I just have to say, thank you to my guests, and anything to shill. So Columba first.
No, I have this article hopefully coming out at the end of the month in this magazine. Apart from that, I can only apologize that I didn't have a lot to contribute to this one. It's not my particular area, but I've learned a lot. It's been very interesting.
Wonderful. Marcus?
No, not much else. Sorry, everyone. I still haven't. We haven't processed our oil, so I haven't uploaded my photos yet on Twitter. I apologize, but Columba, my friend, you compensated for me for many things in areas I've been not strong at. So I'm in much. You've taught me things today. I'm glad I could finally reciprocate. Your boundless knowledge. So
it's a team effort. It's a team effort.
I'm glad we could get into the thick of Byzantium, and like always, I look forward to the audience. I look forward to the next stream. And
yes, I think I was certainly the Lepidus this time, but
no, never. We're a triumvirate, my friend. We're a triumvirate.
All right, everyone. Thank you for listening, and good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Take care.